Chapter 21:19. Does that mean she won't leave? Now, before Shin Manting remembered anything, he had already coaxed her to get the marriage certificate. She had been awake for more than half a month and her body had almost recovered. Now she was on her period. When Shin Manting is pregnant, he won't let her go no matter what. As he thought about it, he looked at her with a pair of burning eyes. He quickly looked away, reached out to change the bedsheets and said, "Sure, but this problem is not something we can control. If you are pregnant, you can't abort it." When Shin Manting heard this, she subconsciously covered her stomach and said softly, "If I abort it, the child will die, right?" "Yes," Shin Luo replied. He turned his face to look at her seriously and said slowly, "No matter what, it is a small life. If a living human life is erased, what is the difference between it and direct murder?" Looking at Shin Manting in front of him, Shin Luo's expression was solemn. When Shin Manting saw Shin Luo's expression, she was a little frightened and said timidly, "Is not wanting to have a child the same as killing?" "There is no such saying," Shin Luo put the bedsheets down. "It's just that if such a small life is already by your side, not only do you not cherish it, but you would rather choose to abandon it, then isn't that killing? Isn't that right?" His logic was impeccable and Shin Manting was speechless for a moment. She subconsciously stroked her stomach and did not say anything. Just like when you were a child, you were abandoned on the street by your biological parents. If no kind-hearted people sent you to the orphanage at that time, would you be dead now? Then did your biological parents also kill you? Did they also become murderers? "But they gave birth to me." Shin Manting couldn't help but refute. "We haven't given birth yet, have we?" "Why not?" "So you have to raise the child after you are born," Shin Luo interrupted her. "If you are pregnant and don't want to give birth, what is the difference between you and them?" Shin Manting was speechless again. "So if you are pregnant, you must give birth." Shin Luo looked at her with a serious expression. "Giving birth isn't as painful as you think. You've already given birth once. Don't be afraid." This time he would be by her side, accompanying her from start to finish, taking care of her. When Shin Manting saw the look of anticipation on Shin Luo's face, her unwavering heart suddenly wavered. Facing his threatening gaze, she shrunk her neck and said softly, "Then, if I'm pregnant, I'll give birth. If I'm not, I won't give birth." A smile finally appeared on Shin Luo's face. He smiled and gently pulled her closer to him. He planted a kiss on her forehead and said softly, "Okay." When Shin Manting saw the happy expression on Shin Luo's face, she felt as if she was a lamb in a tiger's den. He couldn't help but retort, "If I'm not pregnant, you can't use despicable means to make me pregnant." His little face puffed up, full of warning. Shin Luo froze, but he didn't say anything. He hugged her and planted a kiss on her lips. Shin Manting vaguely guessed something and felt inexplicably unhappy. Chapter 21:20. She was throwing a tantrum. Shin Luo looked at her back and didn't care. He turned around and continued to change the bedsheets. It was always a little difficult to be alone. Shin Manting was sitting by the side playing with the computer. When she saw that Shin Luo had finished changing all the bedsheets, she slowly came over with the computer and lay down beside him. Shin Manting liked watching movies more and more. Ever since Shin Luo took her to watch Gone with the Wind. Today they were watching Inception starring Leonardo DiCaprio. Shin Luo glanced at the computer. It was a little late. "Aren't you going to sleep?" Shin Manting pretended not to hear him and stared at the computer. Shin Luo smiled and quickly lay down and closed his eyes. However, Shin Manting was watching a movie, so it was impossible for Shin Luo to fall asleep. In his mind, he had already unknowingly conceived a plan for the future. After Shin Manting was pregnant, he would put aside the matter of the laboratory and leave everything to Lao Wu. He only needed to go back occasionally and spend the rest of the time with her. In the past 2 years, Shin Manting had been in a coma, which was enough for him to worry about. Next, he would have a good rest for a year. When Shin Manting gave birth to the child, he would go back to the laboratory. If Shin Manting didn't regain her memory, of course, everything would be fine. If she recovered her memories during this period of time, then she would probably hate him a little less on account of how diligent he was and how serious he was. Moreover, he took good care of Xiao Yu. Would that be enough to offset Shin Manting's resentment towards him when she grew up? Shin Luo closed his eyes and lay in bed. His mind was racing. Shin Manting didn't know how much time had passed before she finally covered the laptop and put it aside. Then she carefully lay down. After lying down, Shin Luo and reached out and hugged her. Shin Manting was obviously shocked and her whole body trembled. But she quickly reacted and elbowed Shin Luo. She said coquettishly, "You're so annoying. You're pretending to be asleep when you're not." "I'm not," Shin Luo and smiled. "You just thought I was asleep. When did I tell you that I was asleep?" Shin Manting was a little unhappy and said, "You're twisting words and forcing logic." Shin Luo and hugged her and whispered, "Let's sleep." The heating in the imperial capital had been turned off, and the weather was a little cold. At that moment, Shin Luo Anne's arms were indescribably warm. Shin Manting leaned over and hugged him tightly. She closed her eyes. She was angry just now, but in fact she was already very sleepy and soon fell asleep. However, just like in the past, he still had a series of nightmares. She dreamt that she was standing in the middle of a bustling wedding. Luxury cars were coming and going, and the beautiful bride was holding the hand of the handsome groom. Surrounded by the crowd, they walked out step by step. She watched from afar, watching their backs disappear into the luxurious villa, and then slowly retreated. She didn't know why, even though she was just a bystander at this moment, she couldn't help but feel pain in her heart. It was as if this had happened to him before. He slowly retreated and soon he was out of everyone's sight. Chapter 21:21. Goodbye, Shin Luo. Her voice was filled with indescribable indifference and hatred that he had been familiar with for a long, long time. The low voice was particularly ear-piercing in the night. Shin Luo was awakened from his sleep and turned his head to look at Shin Manting. Shin Manting was very quiet, as if what he had just heard was just an illusion. He gently hugged Shin Manting beside him, his heart beating heavily. But his heart was getting emptier. Shin Manting seemed to feel Shin Luo's touch and embrace and consciously leaned into his arms. Shin Luo held her in his arms and pinched the soft flesh on her waist that had grown in the past half a month. He couldn't help but call out softly, "Manting." His voice was very soft and slightly trembling. Shin Manting seemed to have heard Shin Luo's voice and seemed to have dreamed of something happy. She snuggled into his arms and smiled with an indescribable emotion. Shin Luo had been paying attention to her expression, but under such weak light he couldn't see it clearly. But Shin Manting was indeed smiling. Shin Luo couldn't help but call out softly again, "Manting." Shin Manting didn't respond this time and just breathed evenly. But Shin Luo couldn't fall asleep. He didn't know how long he had been awake, but Shin Manting suddenly moved. Shin Luo clearly felt it and looked down. Soon Shin Manting moved again and said dreamily, "Shin Luo Shin Luo Shin Luo's body suddenly stiffened. Although her voice was soft, the indifference in it was still real and Shin Luo could hear it clearly. This soft call seemed to be just a temporary nightmare. Soon Shin Manting calmed down. He subconsciously hugged her tightly and his heart was in a mess. After a long time Shin Manting sobbed again. "Oh, I beg you," Shin Luo was on the verge of breaking down. He hugged her tightly in his arms and couldn't hold himself back any longer. His breathing became heavy and he called out softly, "Manting, Manting, wake up. Don't continue. Wake up, wake up." His voice was choked with sobs filled with panic and guilt. Shin Luo admitted that he was selfish. He never wanted Shin Manting to regain her memory. From the moment he knew that she was no longer Shin Manting, he had already made up his mind to keep her by his side. Now she could dream more and more of the past and she was getting closer and closer to regaining her memory. Absolutely not. Shin Luo's excessive action woke Shin Manting up. When she opened her eyes, her face seemed to be a little wet, especially her eyes. Her vision was obscured by tears. Shin Manting looked at him blankly and called, "Luos." Shin Manting was a little confused. She looked at him and shouted, "Hubby." Manting was a Shin Luo calmed down when he heard the familiar voice. Lowering his eyes, he looked into her clear eyes and couldn't help but hug her tightly. Lowering his head, he gently kissed her lips. His movement was so sudden that Shin Manting didn't have time to react and was swept away by him in an instant. Shin Luo's movements were a little heavy and urgent. She wasn't sure if it was an illusion, but she actually felt that he was a little nervous. She placed her palm on his back and gently patted him like how he usually comforted her. Chapter 21-22. Feeling Shin Luo An's emotions, Shin Manting suddenly remembered a very impressive sentence in a movie that she had watched recently. People who have no sense of security will feel nervous because they are afraid of losing. For some reason, this sentence automatically came to Shin Manting's mind. Shin Luo An noticed Shin Manting's movements, and inexplicably felt more at ease, and his movements unconsciously became much gentler. The kiss didn't last long and soon Shin Luo An let go of Shin Manting. Shin Manting opened her eyes and looked at him and asked softly, "Honey, did you have a nightmare?" Her soft voice was particularly seductive in this night. Her tone was completely different from the indifference and alienation she had when she was sleeping. This Shin Manting was even more pleasing to him. Shin Luo An gently hugged her and whispered, "I dreamed that you were going to leave me just like 2 or 3 years ago." When Shin Manting heard this, she immediately pushed him away and said, "Honey, how can you curse your own wife like this?" His own wife. Shin Luo An couldn't help but smile, and the anxiety in his heart dissipated in an instant. "Didn't I have a car accident 2 or 3 years ago?" Shin Manting rebuked, "I won't. Don't curse me or I'll be hit by a car again and you'll lose your wife again." Shin Luo An smiled, held her in his arms and whispered, "Yes, I won't. But honey, I also had a nightmare." Shin Manting hooked his shoulder and pouted, "I dreamed that I gave birth to a child and you weren't by my side. I was alone in the hospital and I was so scared. Then I stayed in the hospital alone and I didn't have food to eat. I was so hungry and then I bought the same food as others, but I couldn't eat because I gave birth to a child." As she spoke, Shin Manting's voice gradually became softer with a little sadness. "I feel so pitiful, so sad, and my heart hurts as if it really happened." Shin Manting hugged Shin Luo An tighter and her heart ached and she whispered softly, "But these dreams are fake, right? These things didn't happen at all and they're not real. Honey, you wouldn't treat me like that. You wouldn't even come to see me after I gave birth, would you?" Shin Luo An's heart was empty for a moment and it was terrible. Yes, it was very possible that all of these things had happened. At that time Shin Manting gave birth and he was 2 days late. When she gave birth, it was the time when she needed the child's father the most, but he wasn't there. The day after she gave birth was when a woman was at her weakest and he wasn't there. It was only on the 3rd day that he finally arrived. He had let her down. Shin Luo An was silent for a while before he said, "I told you it was a dream. It's impossible not to feel anything. But a dream is a dream." He caressed her long hair and said softly, "Don't take it seriously." Shin Manting hugged him and felt a little more at ease. She rubbed herself against his chest and said coquettishly, "Hubby, my stomach hurts. It's bloated and painful. Help me rub it." She reached out and pulled his palm to touch her lower abdomen. Shin Luo An's warm palms caressed her lower abdomen, massaging it gently. Chapter 21-23. She didn't know how many times she had woken up from her sleep. Shin Manting looked at the ceiling blankly. She subconsciously reached out to touch her side, but it was already empty with only a little residual warmth. She got up and was surrounded by a dazzling light. At the same time, the door of the bathroom was opened. Shin Manting looked over and saw Shin Luo An dressed neatly coming out from inside. When he saw her, Shin Luo An stepped forward. Shin Manting shrank back as if she was facing a formidable enemy. She seemed to be at a loss and exclaimed, "Shin Luo An." Shin Luo An stopped moving forward and his back stiffened. Looking at Shin Manting in front of him in disbelief, Shin Luo An suddenly panicked. But soon Shin Manting's face became a little blank. Looking at Shin Luo An, she frowned and said, "Honey." Shin Manting's voice was filled with confusion. She looked up at Shin Luo An, who was standing still, and put her palm on her chest. Shin Luo An felt as if his heart was being squeezed. He looked at Shin Manting in front of him and walked over step by step. Shin Manting looked at him and her eyes trembled, but she resisted. She shrank back, lay down again and covered herself with the quilt. Shin Luo An stopped moving and stood still, pursing his lips. No one made a sound and the room was very quiet. After a long time Shin Luo An said, "Are you not feeling well?" Shin Manting didn't say anything and covered herself with the quilt with her back to him. Shin Luo An walked over and said, "Girls are more uncomfortable these days. but it will be over in a few days. Do you want to get up and change the cushion? It's not good for your health if you use it for a long time. Shin Manting's eyes were tightly shut, and she subconsciously clamped her legs together. Her bow was a little wet and it felt like it was dirty again. Feeling a little embarrassed, Shin Manting whispered with her back to him, "Honey, help me find one. I'll change it myself." Shin Luo An's heart calmed down, and his originally tense mood and expression completely relaxed at this moment. He was in a good mood and replied, "Okay." Shin Luo An went to the cabinet and took out a tablet that Mrs. Shin had prepared some time ago and handed it to her. Shin Manting's head popped out from under the quilt and her cheeks were red. He reached out his hand to pull it back but quickly retracted it and said, "You can go. I'll get up by myself." It was very likely that his pants would be dirted. It was too embarrassing. Shin Manting shyly covered herself with the blanket, not daring to show her face. Suddenly she heard Shin Luo An's chuckle. Then the sound of his footsteps gradually faded away. He didn't get up until he heard the door open and close. Shin Manting blushed. She pinched the thing in her hand and lifted the quilt. On the dark bedsheet, there was an even darker mark that was very eye-catching. As expected, Shin Manting held the piece of pink bread in her hand and slowly made her way to the bathroom. Only then did he realize that his pants were all dirty. Crestfallen, he returned to the cloakroom to search for clean clothes. When he opened the drawer, he saw the 2 red booklets that had been quietly placed there not long ago. The 3 golden words were especially eye-catching. She didn't know why, but when she saw those 3 words she felt very uncomfortable. When he opened it, the photo of the 2 of them was especially eye-catching. His breathing became short, and his head felt as if it had been hit by a sharp object. Shin Manting's vision darkened and her legs gave way. She fell to the ground. Chapter 21-24. The whole world was shaking and everything familiar around her seemed to be far away. It was so familiar that it was no longer familiar. She fell limply, unable to muster up any strength. Shin Luo An closed the door behind him, but he didn't leave. He leaned against the door, panicking for no reason. A voice in his heart strongly reminded him that she was about to wake up. He had this feeling before, but it had never been as strong as it was now. His heart was beating strongly. Quickly, with panic and guilt, Shin Luo An hesitated for a moment, then opened the door again. However, he heard heavy breathing coming from the cloakroom. His heart skipped a beat and he strode forward. Shin Manting was lying on the ground, her eyes half closed, and she looked over with difficulty. Her eyes were filled with all kinds of emotions. 4 Shin Luo, and each of them carried a heavy and fatal destructive force. Subconsciously holding his breath, Shin Luo An felt that something was quickly withdrawing from him. Shin Manting looked at him and seemed to twitch her lips. At the same time, a drop of water fell from the corner of her eye. The next moment, Shin Manting weakly lowered her head and closed her eyes. Manting! Shin Luo An felt terribly empty and he picked her up. At this moment, Shin Manting's face was pale and she leaned against him weakly. She had already lost consciousness. Shin Luo An looked at her and his heart trembled. He panicked and lost. The smell of disinfectant was very unpleasant. Shin Manting opened her eyes, and there was a burst of pain in her lower abdomen. She stared at the white ceiling above her head and after a long time she looked away. She sat up and it was quiet all around. The lights in the ward were not on and the windows were open. The wind was a little strong and the curtains were rolled up high, fluttering. At the same time there was a faint smell of tobacco. Shin Manting looked sideways and saw a figure standing by the window, both elbows leaning on the windowsill, holding a cigarette between his fingers. It's him. Shin Manting smiled silently and raised her hand to touch the top of her left 5th rib. Here his heart was beating faster and faster. This was the feeling of being alive. He was still alive. Still alive. Shin Luo An put out the cigarette, turned around and looked at her. At this moment, Shin Manting's eyes were clear and her mind was clear. A pair of eyes looked at him indifferently and calmly. The corners of her pale lips curled up slightly. She seemed to be mocking him, but at the same time, it also seemed to be a greeting between old friends. She said, "Shin Luo An." Shin Luo An felt a lump in his throat, and an indescribable sense of suffocation welled up from the bottom of his heart. His body tensed up and he slowly walked forward. Shin Manting looked at him. She was surprisingly calm. She watched helplessly as Shen Luo and walked up to her and smiled. His smile was filled with a gentleness she had never seen before. It was as if he was facing another person. Or perhaps he was facing another Shen Manting. "You're awake." Shen Luo, Anne's voice was soft and gentle. He reached out and was about to touch her forehead. Shen Manting narrowed her eyes and raised her hand to slap him away. Shen Luo, and paused for a moment, then calmly retracted his hand. The smile on his face didn't change. He walked to the bedside table and said, "Mom just stewed some soup. It took a long time. Drink it quickly and you'll be discharged. Your son is waiting for Mom and Dad to come home." However, Shen Manting looked at him expressionlessly. Looking at the gentle smile on his face, she felt extremely sarcastic in her heart. The corner of Shen Manting's mouth twitched coldly and she said slowly, "Is it interesting?" Chapter 21-25. The thermos rolled on the ground twice, but it was safe and sound. However, Shen Luo and remained motionless as if he had been struck by lightning. With his back facing her, an indescribable bitterness welled up in him. It broke through his throat, broke through his shackles and overflowed into his eyes. In the end it had come. What he feared and worried about still couldn't escape. Shen Manting looked at his back coldly and asked, "How long was I lying there?" Shen Luo and suppressed his surging emotions and kept his back facing her. He bent down to pick up the thermos and wiped it with 2 tissues before saying, "A day, about 12 hours. Shen Manting was stunned and sneered, "Do you think I'm an idiot? If it's 12 hours it should be dawn by now. Moreover, I was hit by a car." But there was no pain on her body. It was strange. She clearly felt that she was in so much pain that she was about to die. The sound of bones breaking seemed to still be ringing in her body. But now her limbs were fine and she didn't feel any pain at all. Except for her stomach. There was a familiar pain in her lower abdomen. It must be her period. When the car accident happened, she had just finished her period and it happened in the middle of the night. If it had been 12 hours, it should be past 10 o'clock in the morning. Without a doubt, Shen Luo and was lying to her. He had put in a lot of effort to escape the blame for the car accident. He had to make soup and smile. It was hard on him. Shen Manting only felt sarcastic, but she didn't realize that Shen Luo and was once again frozen in place. With his back facing her, Shen Luo and had a crazy thought. She seemed to have forgotten everything that had happened during this period of time, including marrying him and those days and nights of indulgence. "Wait, I'll ask Jilia to come." Shen Luo and put the thermos back on the bedside table and walked out without looking back. After closing the door, Shen Luo and called Shen Jilia with trembling hands. The call was quickly connected and Shen Jilia's voice came through. "Brother." "Jilia, Manting is awake, but..." Shen Jilia looked at Shen Manting in front of him and asked again, "Do you remember the date of the car accident?" "I don't remember." "How long do you think you slept?" "Not long, it feels like less than a day." "Yeah." Shen Jilia nodded. "Do you still remember me?" "What do you think?" she asked. Shen Jilia chuckled and opened his arms to her. "Sister Manting, welcome back." Shen Manting was a little dazed as he hugged her. But it was only for a moment before Shen Jilia let go. "Brother, come out for a moment." Shen Luo and already knew. Shen Manting couldn't remember returning to the time when she was 12 years old. She couldn't remember anything that had happened since she first woke up this morning. "From the looks of it, it's selective amnesia," Shen Jilia said slowly. "It's actually quite normal for such a situation to occur." "Jilia," Shen Luo Anne's voice was a little hoarse. "She still hates me just like before." Shen Jilia was silent. For a moment he didn't know what to say. He patted him on the shoulder and said, "Take it slow. You can't rush things." Shen Luo and remained silent. Shen Jilia looked at him for a long time before whispering, "I think you should be glad that she can't remember." Chapter 21-26. Shen Luo and fell silent again. Shen Jilia felt sympathy for him. He patted him on the shoulder and said, "Sister Manting just said that she wants to be discharged." "Yes." The entire journey back home was silent. Shen Manting went straight to her nanny's room. The nanny's room was very, very small. After 2 years of accumulation, it had become a storeroom. At this moment it was filled with things. The things that he had used in the past, old and new, were all gone. Her phone was nowhere to be found. Shin Manting was silent for a long time before she sighed heavily. Before the accident, she had been sleeping in his room. It didn't seem to matter if he slept with her again. However, time seemed to pass for a very, very long time. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for them to pile up to this extent in just one day. How long had she slept? "Do you need this thing?" Shin Luo and asked, startling Shin Manting. Shin Luo and turned around and saw a pack of sanitary napkins in his hand. Shin Manting glanced at it and grabbed it, saying, "Of course I need it." "All right. Come to my room and sleep." Shin Luo and turned around and said, "There are too many things here. It'll take some time to tidy them up." Shin Manting remained silent and stood with her back to him. Shin Luo and sighed and said, "I'll sleep on the sofa. Come over." With that, Shin Luo and's footsteps faded away. Shin Manting turned her head and saw his back. The lights in the corridor cast a long shadow on his body. Shin Manting felt a little complicated. She held the bag in her hand, turned around and walked into the room. He would not wrong himself. Shin Manting went to the cloakroom and found many well-fitting clothes. However, his style seemed to be much cuter than hers. They were all pink, red, green, and blue. They were all cute pink colors. He found a set of pink bunny pajamas and took a bath before falling asleep. Shin Luo and sat in the living room and smoked. Shin Luo and seemed to have expected all of this, so when it came, he didn't seem to feel anything other than heaviness. He was still the same. Just like 2 years ago. 2 years ago she wouldn't have left. 2 years later, would she still not leave? So be it. That was pretty good too. As long as she was still around, that was what he was thinking, but the smoke drifted up and into his eyes, stinging his eyes. Chuckling softly, he extinguished the cigarette. However, it was so uncomfortable that it was almost suffocating. He lay down and covered himself with a thin blanket. He closed his eyes, but his consciousness was clear. After an unknown period of time, he suddenly heard a cry. The sound of a woman crying. Shin Luo and opened his eyes abruptly. Before he could react, he heard the sound of the door opening and the crying suddenly became louder. He sat up and looked into the distance. It was Shin Manting. When Shin Manting saw him, she sniffed hard and rushed over to him, shouting, "Hubby!" Shin Luo and was stunned. Before he could react, he was hugged by her soft body. Shin Manting cried loudly and hugged his neck tightly. She sobbed and shouted, "Honey, I just had a nightmare. I was scared to death." Sob. Shin Luo and couldn't react at all. He subconsciously raised his hands to hug her, but he didn't dare to raise them. For a moment they were frozen in midair. The commotion outside had also awakened the others. Shin Jilye came out of the room and turned on the lights. Shin Luo and subconsciously narrowed his eyes and looked over. Chapter 21-27. Shin Manting also looked over and saw that it was Shin Jilye. She wiped her eyes and wanted to stop. However, she still couldn't control herself and burst into tears. "Jilye." Shin Jilye looked at Shin Manting and then at Shin Luo and he saw that Shin Luo and was also at a loss. Shin Luo and turned around and patted her back gently. He said slowly, "Good girl, don't cry." Shin Manting's crying stopped a little. She sat in Shin Luo's arms and sobbed, "Hubby." Sob. Shin Luo and looked at her in silence. He looked at her and found that at this moment, her eyes were clear and clouded with a layer of mist. She was looking at him with a wronged expression. She was like a child who got up in the middle of the night and couldn't find her parents. She was at a loss and helpless. Shin Jilye saw it clearly and called out, "Sister-in-law." Shin Manting looked over and wiped her eyes while sobbing. Shin Luo and gave her a tissue. His emotions were very complicated. Shin Manting took it and wiped her tears and blew her nose. She said pitifully, "Did I wake you up? Go to sleep. I just had a nightmare." "Okay," Shin Jilye replied, but he didn't leave. Instead, he stepped forward and asked, "What did you dream about?" Shin Jilye wasn't the only one who was curious about this question. Even Shin Luo and turned his head away. Shin Manting sobbed and said, "I dreamed that I chased my husband away." As she spoke, she trembled as she cried and her tears once again poured down. "But my heart, it hurts so much. I don't want to drive my husband away, but I can't control myself. Oh, so sad." His voice was intermittent and he sounded like he was about to cry. Shinluo, and was silent and gently patted her back. She looked up at Shinjilia and found that his face was solemn. What's wrong? Yi Qianqian's voice came over. Yi Qianqian walked over in her nightgown. When she saw Shin Manting sobbing, she touched Shinjilia and asked, "Did you quarrel?" "It's okay." Shinjilia squeezed Yi Qianqian's hand and looked at Shinluo. He said meaningfully, "Brother, take sister-in-law in first." "Yes," Shinluo, and replied. He got up and gently pulled her along. "Let's go in first." Shin Manting was sobbing obediently. As soon as she entered the room, she hugged his neck tightly and whispered, "Hubby, do you love me?" Shinluo, and was about to be pulled up. He pulled her into his embrace and sighed softly, "Love, of course I love you. Then can you promise me one thing?" Shin Manting looked up at him with an aggrieved expression. "If I chase you away in the future, it will definitely be fake. I don't want to chase you away. If I'm not dreaming, I'll really chase you away. Don't go. I don't want you to go. Don't go." Shinluo, Anne's heart softened. He couldn't help but lower his head and kiss her. His palm brushed through her hair and he whispered, "What if you're serious about chasing me away?" "That's impossible," Shin Manting said with a serious expression. "That's not me. Hubby, don't go." "What if I take it seriously?" Shinluo Anne's voice was as light as a feather and ethereal. Shin Manting choked on her words and stared at him blankly. After a long time she said, "Then, when I wake up from my dream, I'll go after you." Yi Qianqian felt that something was wrong. Why was Shin Manting crying in the living room all of a sudden? She nudged Shinjilia and said, "Old Shin, big brother's temper is terrible. Did he get angry at Manting?" Chapter 21-28. Yi Qianqian felt that everything was strange. She suddenly remembered and said, "By the way, hubby, didn't you tell me that Manting regained her memory? Why is she, Shu?" Shinjilia put his finger to his lips and sat down on the bed. He frowned and thought for a while before saying, "Well, I'm afraid it's a little troublesome." Shinluo, and coaxed Shin Manting to sleep before he walked out. He reached out and knocked on Shinjilia's door twice. Then he walked straight to the sofa and sat down. Shinjilia walked out and saw Shinluo Anne's solemn expression. He asked, "Was Sister Manting asleep just now?" Then she suddenly woke up and became the 12-year-old Manting again? Shinluo, and took out a cigarette, lit it and responded calmly. "Yes, it's a split personality." Shinjilia finished his diagnosis and said it word by word. Every word made Shinluo and feel very complicated. He looked at Shinjilia and asked, "What do you mean?" To put it simply, it's very likely that sister-in-law doesn't want to remember the past, but there's another consciousness in her subconscious that is trying to awaken this memory. Shinjilia slowly analyzed, "Sister Manting wants to wake up, but sister-in-law doesn't want to. There's a difference between the two and from one person to two people." But now Shinjilia's words made it clear that he treated Shin Manting as a completely different person. Shinluo, and was silent. He smoked silently and his mind was in a mess. "Is this a split personality?" Yi Qianqian leaned over with a look of disbelief on her face. "I've only seen it in novels and comics. How could Manting hit someone?" Shinjilia said. "So far, neither Sister Manting nor sister-in-law are aggressive." "Yes, I think so too." Yi Qianqian sat beside Shinluo, and then felt a little sorry for him. She asked, "Brother, is sister-in-law asleep now?" "Yes." Shinluo, and had a headache and reached out to rub his temples. "What should I do?" He couldn't stand Shin Manting like this. He couldn't tell when it was her and when it was her. He had no idea. "Do you want sister-in-law to wake up or Sister Manting to wake up?" Shinjilia asked slowly. Shinluo, and smoked his cigarette and looked up at Shinjilia. Shinjilia's expression was indescribably solemn. Shinluo, and didn't know what he was feeling at that moment. He let out a long puff of smoke and laughed. "I don't know." He really didn't know. Both Shin Manting and Shin Manting were Shin Manting. Only when the two of them existed together could Shin Manting be the real Shin Manting. This situation was completely out of his expectations. He felt lucky and sorrowful at the same time. Of the two personalities, one is the primary personality, which dominates most of the body's consciousness and actions. The secondary personality is in a passive state. Shinjilia said slowly. From what I heard from sister-in-law, when Sister Manting is active, she may not be sure if she's dreaming or really moving, but it's very likely that she's aware of it. Then when she's on the move, does Manting also sense it? Yi Qianqian asked. Both Manting and the two men understood who she was referring to. Chapter 21-29. When Shin Manting woke up, she was surrounded by light. She got up and went to the bathroom. At a glance, she saw the toiletries by the sink. They were very familiar. There was a pink toothbrush, a pink cup, and a cute strawberry-flavored toothpaste. It was so childish. Shin Manting picked them up naturally and brushed her teeth. After washing her face carefully, she naturally went to the cloakroom and found a dress to change into. She walked to the door in a good mood. When she reached out to open the door, she suddenly stopped. All of this seemed so familiar that she didn't need anyone's guidance. Shin Manting froze and stopped moving. She turned her head and looked at the huge suite behind her. The suite was very large. In this villa, besides Shin Longyue's room, Shin Luo An's room was the largest. It was so spacious that it was dazzling. Every decoration and every piece of furniture was familiar to her. It was obviously completely different from before the car accident. Shin Luo An was more solemn and had a cold temper. He liked cool colors. But there were a lot of pink and green things in this room. Were they the children's? Oh, it shouldn't be. In addition to the toys, there were decorations on the wall, photos. Yes, the photo wall. Shin Manting looked over and saw the wall full of photo frames. She hadn't noticed before. These things were very natural. It was as if they had always been there. And Shin Manting remembered that Shin Luo An never liked to do these things. Shin Manting walked over and was slightly taken aback. Everything was too familiar. Pictures after pictures, faces after faces. There was him and her. In one of them, she and Shin Luo An were holding a fair and tender child who looked 1 or 2 years old, smiling brightly. And Shin Luo An was looking at her with a smile, his eyes deep and gentle. Shin Manting felt that something was wrong. The woman in the photo was too thin. Thinner than she was at her thinnest. Was it her? The child they were holding. The features were very similar to Shin Luo An's. Was it her son? Shin Manting suddenly became enlightened. She looked at the child in the photo and suddenly seemed to understand. The child was her and Shin Luo An's child. Before the car accident, the child was only a few months old, but now looking at the photo, he was at least 1 or 2 years old. She really slept for a long time. At least a year. But when he looked at himself in the photo, he had a heavy feeling of doubt. She had just woken up. Why was she taking photos with Shin Luo An? She stood beside Shin Luo An with the baby in her arms and a bright smile on her face. It was as if she was truly happy. She stood beside Shin Luo An without any ill feelings. His demeanor made Shin Manting a little uncomfortable. This wasn't her. It couldn't be her. However, she knew better than anyone that this was her. This was Shin Manting. Even the small mole under the earlobe was exactly the same. This was something that no substitute could replicate. But how could that be possible? Shin Manting subconsciously took a step back in disbelief. Knock knock. There was a careful knock on the door. Shin Manting turned her head and soon she saw that the door had been opened. Shin Luo An walked in looking exhausted. He was still wearing yesterday's clothes. When he saw Shin Manting's dazed expression, he knew who she was. Chapter 21-30. It was already past 10 o'clock and most of his family members had already left for work. Nanny he was playing outside with Little Moon while Yi Qianqian was sitting on the sofa outside, ready to rush over if anything happened. The two people in the room sat facing each other and neither of them spoke first. Shin Manting flipped her hair. She wasn't in a hurry. She drank the soy milk in front of her and nibbled on the bread, waiting for him to speak first. However, even after she had finished her breakfast, she did not hear the man in front of her utter a single word. She couldn't take it anymore. She looked at him and frowned. "Weren't you the one who wanted to talk to me?" "Yes," Shin Luo An replied. "Manting, you haven't seen your son since you woke up, have you?" As she spoke, she stood up. "I'll bring my son in." Shin Manting was baffled. She frowned and shouted, "Shin Luo An, what the hell are you doing?" Shin Luo An quickly opened the door and walked out. When Yi Qianqian heard the commotion, she immediately craned her neck to take a look. Shin Luo and ignored her and quickly walked over to his son. He said, "Baby, do you miss your mother?" Little Moon was playing with his building blocks. When he heard this, he immediately stood up and nodded. "Yes." Shenluo, and picked up the baby and quickly returned to the room. The moment he stepped into the room, Yi Qianqian looked at him again. He closed the door and quickly turned around with his son in his arms. "Mom!" Little Moon shouted happily. He opened his arms and gestured in Shin Manting's direction. "Little Moon missed you." Shin Manting stared blankly at the child in front of her. She still couldn't wrap her head around what was happening. This is her son. Shenluo, and walked over with Shin Yueshao in his arms and handed the baby to her. Shin Manting hugged him in a daze, and the little boy immediately took the initiative to hug her. He kissed her on the lips and said, "Mommy, kiss me." Although the little guy said that, his body was not honest at all. He wriggled around in Shin Manting's arms. Finally, he wrapped his arms around her neck and stood on her lap. Throughout the entire process, Shin Manting didn't have any reaction other than supporting herself with her hands. Looking at Shin Yuexiao's familiar face, she didn't feel anything strange in her heart. But at the same time, it was filled with a sense of wonder. It shouldn't be like this, but it should be like this. A very strange feeling. Shin Manting lowered her head and hugged Shin Yuexiao in her arms. "Little Moon," she called. "Mom." Little Moon was very excited to hear Shin Manting call his name. "Ride the wooden horse." "Do you want to ride a wooden horse?" Shin Manting chuckled. "How about I take you there?" "Great." Little Moon looked very excited. "Put on your shoes." "All right, I'll take you there." Shin Manting stood up and walked out with the baby in her arms. Without any guidance or warning, she actually entered the baby's nursery. Yi Qianqian stood outside and watched Shin Manting walk in. She subconsciously stood up and followed her. When Shin Manting saw Yi Qianqian, she was a little surprised and asked, "Qianqian, aren't you going to work?" When Yi Qianqian heard that, she chuckled and looked a little embarrassed. "I stopped working a long time ago. What do you want?" "Help Little Moon put on his shoes. Let's go to the amusement park later. The baby wants to go." Shin Manting put Shin Yuexiao down and found his shoes. Chapter 21:31. However, it turned out that schizophrenia was no different from an ordinary person. After Shin Manting helped Shin Yuexiao put on his shoes, she stood up and looked at Yi Qianqian. "Do you want to go with me? Let's go together. And let's ride the wooden horse." Shin Yuexiao looked at Yi Qianqian and extended his hand with the most sincere smile. "Let's play together." Yi Qianqian looked at him and asked cautiously, "Big brother, are you not going?" Sure enough, as soon as she said that, she found that Shin Manting's expression did not look good. He coughed lightly and said, "I just think that if we go out to play, it'll be more fun for a family of 3, right? Besides, sister-in-law, your health hasn't recovered yet. It's more appropriate for a man to take care of you." "Forget it." Shin Manting did not give her any face at all. "Shenluo, and has to go to the laboratory now. He's very busy." Yi Qianqian felt that she had said the wrong thing. It seemed that Shin Manting's hatred for Shenluo and was not light at all. She thought about it and said, "I want to go. I'm bored to death at home. Wait for me. I'll go change my clothes." "Okay," Shin Manting replied. Yi Qianqian felt uncomfortable all over. She was used to the enthusiasm and vivacity of the 12-year-old Shin Manting. Now that the real Shin Manting was here, she felt that she was cold everywhere. It was as if the whole family owed her 5 million yuan. But she did not owe them. Yi Qianqian quickly changed into a new set of clothes and happily rolled out. She glanced at her and said, "Sister-in-law, you didn't bring your bag? The bag we bought together a few days ago looks good on you." "Which one?" Shin Manting asked subconsciously. Yi Qianqian noticed that she called her sister-in-law, but she did not seem to notice. She answered every time she called her sister-in-law, and her answers were very smooth. Her heart was slightly moved, but she did not show it on her face. She said, "The pink one with a lump of hair hanging on it." "The pink one with hair hanging on it?" The image of the bag immediately appeared in Shin Manting's mind. She subconsciously said, "Is it the one that looks like a camera?" Yes. Yi Qianqian nodded. "Take it and go. We might have to queue up for a long time." However, Shin Manting remained silent. He looked at Yi Qianqian and frowned. Yi Qianqian froze, but she didn't let it show on her face. She asked, "What's wrong? What happened to me yesterday?" Yi Qianqian didn't know how to respond to the sudden question. She thought about it for a moment before answering. He probably fainted. Why did you suddenly faint? Maybe Aunt Flo came and she wasn't feeling well, so she fainted. It's not like I've never had my period before. Shin Manting looked straight at her. Moreover, my memory only stops at the time of the car accident. When I woke up, I was alive and kicking. You don't seem to find it strange. Oh. Yi Qianqian's expression was calm. I know. You lost your memory. Argelier is a psychiatrist. What's so strange about this? The strangest thing about her was actually her essence. After Yi Qianqian labeled Shin Manting as a psycho in her heart, she could no longer look her in the eye. However, she could not say it. Shin Manting frowned. You know that I lost my memory. Do you think I'm the same as before yesterday? Chapter 2132. Of course it's different. I've already said that you're split. How can it be the same? However, what she was thinking in her heart was not what she said. Facing Shin Manting's strange gaze, Yi Qianqian calmly said, "It's the same. What's the difference? You're still you." Shin Manting was speechless. But why did she feel that something was wrong? She put the baby down and said, "I'll go look for the baby." Yi Qianqian was finally free. She quickly took the baby and let out a long sigh. Shin Manting walked into the room. Shin Luo, and was still sitting in his original position with a pack of cigarettes in front of him. When he saw her come in, he subconsciously covered the cigarette between his fingers and looked at her. Shin Manting's first reaction was to say, "Why are you smoking again?" Such a subconscious reaction popped up like a conditioned reflex. But she held it back. Her mouth moved but no sound came out. Shin Luo and saw her expression and reached out to snuff out the cigarette. He said, "I'm not smoking anymore." Shin Manting frowned and felt a little panicked. This kind of panic came inexplicably. She walked into the cloakroom with ease, but her heart was beating faster and faster. In the cloakroom there was a special compartment for storing bags. There were all kinds of leather bags in it. Pink, green, pink, blue, black, and white, a lot. It was said that it could cure all kinds of diseases. Her bag could cure more diseases than 100 diseases. It was too shocking. They were all hers. Thump, thump. Her heart was beating fast. Shin Manting reached out and grabbed the pink camera bag. She opened it and saw all the IDs in it. Everything that should be there was there. There was also a beautiful and delicate purse that looked like a notepad. When she opened it, there was a stack of cash. It was not much, only about 1,000 yuan. But there were several cards lined up inside. There were gold, blue, and green cards. There were 2 savings cards and a credit card. On the back of the card, the owner's name was written in 3 big characters. Shin Luo Un. Shin Manting even felt like she was dreaming when she put everything away. When did she get along with Shin Luo? And so well and harmoniously. 2/3 of the cloakroom was filled with her clothes and a large variety of bags. On the dressing table, luxurious skincare products were placed, as well as all kinds of expensive and luxurious jewelry. His head was throbbing. The sudden awakening and everything she had was completely different from her previous life and everything she had imagined. Shin Manting crouched down with her arms around her head and groaned in pain. When Shin Luo and heard the faint sound, he immediately stood up and walked in. When he saw Shin Manting squatting on the ground, he vaguely guessed what had happened. He stepped forward and stood by her side, asking softly, "Are you not feeling well?" Uncomfortable. It was indeed uncomfortable. She looked up and saw Shin Luo. He was very tall and stood against the light. Under the heavy shadows, she could clearly see the complex expression on his face. Shin Manting frowned. She didn't know where the anger came from, but it was stuck in her chest. She opened her mouth and said, "Did you do a lot of bad things when I was unconscious?" Shin Luo and was taken aback by the sudden question. Chapter 2133. Obviously she couldn't. Shin Manting wouldn't accept it. She couldn't accept it. Staring at Shin Luo and above her head, Shin Manting wanted to get angry but she couldn't. It was as if there was another consciousness in her heart that was preventing her from getting angry with him. This feeling came suddenly and inexplicably and Shin Manting felt suffocated. She stood up but her head still hurt. Shin Luo and saw her look and stepped closer. He didn't show any emotion on his face and said softly, "I can't make it up." Shin Manting looked up at him with anger in her eyes. Unexpectedly, Shin Luo and took a step forward and stood in front of her. "But I still have to make it up," Shin Luo and looked at her and said, "I'm trying my best whether I can make it up or not." Shin Manting looked at Shin Luo and in front of her and felt familiar yet strange. Was Shin Luo and like this? That's not it. Shin Luo and wasn't like this. Besides, Shin Luo and said again and stared deeply into Shin Manting's eyes with a pair of amber eyes. "I'm not just giving you material things." Shin Manting was forced to take a step back under his gaze. Shin Luo and took another step forward and said slowly, "I'm also giving you my heart." Shin Manting felt uncomfortable all over and took another step back. Unexpectedly, Shin Luo and reached out and held her hand. Shin Manting was shocked. Before she could react, Shin Luo and held her hand and pressed it to his heart. "Here, it's beating for you." It was obviously a normal body temperature, a normal warmth. Shin Manting felt inexplicably scorching. Shin Manting immediately withdrew her hand. She pretended to be frightened and shouted, "Shin Luo, are you crazy?" His words made her so disgusted that she had goosebumps all over her body. How could such words come out of Shin Luo An's mouth? "Yes, I'm crazy," Shin Luo An said calmly. Shin Luo An replied calmly, "I almost went crazy when you got into that car accident 2 years ago." 2 years ago. Shin Manting was in a trance when she heard this. "I've always regretted it," Shin Luo An said as he held her hand. "If I had reflected on myself and not pushed you so hard, or if my temper had been a little better, would things have turned out differently?" Shin Manting shuddered and said, I've been waiting for you to wake up for the past 2 years," Shin Luo An interrupted her. "You were bedridden for 2 years. You were in a vegetative state for 2 years. Do you know that?" Shin Manting widened her eyes and looked at Shin Luo An in disbelief. She was in a vegetative state for 2 years? How could she possibly know? "I'm really afraid that you'll never wake up." Shin Luo An took another step forward and forced her into a corner. "Little Moon is still so young. He needs his mother." Shin Manting didn't know what to say. She stared blankly at Shin Luo An. There was a faint smell of tobacco on his body, but it wasn't unpleasant. It seemed that he was used to it, so he didn't feel any disgust. On the contrary, she felt that his scent made her feel very safe. Shin Manting looked away and her heart wavered for a moment. He wore a simple shirt and stood straight. He looked thin and gentle. However, there was an unconcealable tiredness in his eyes and a strong sense of affection. Chapter 2134. Shin Luo An covered her face with his palm. His eyes were gentle, and he seemed to be different from the manic and immoral man in her memory. Shin Manting shrank back and reached out to grab his hand that was caressing her cheek. Shin Luo An took the opportunity to hold her hand and said softly, "Believe me, every word I'm saying now is true." His words were full of sincerity. Shin Manting found them familiar. It was as if Shin Luo An had said them before she knew it. Every word automatically overlapped in her mind. There was a shadow in her mind that overlapped with Shin Luo An in front of her. Shin Luo An's affectionate look made Shin Manting's mind a mess. Shin Manting's head hurt even more. She frowned and lowered her head. "Shin Luo An, my head hurts." Shin Luo An's eyes flashed and he said, "Go lie down for a while." As he spoke, he picked her up without hesitation. Shin Manting screamed and immediately hugged Shin Luo An's neck. She steadied herself and looked sideways at Shin Luo An's handsome face. She closed her eyes and felt dizzy. Shin Manting was placed on the bed and soon closed her eyes. Shin Luo An sat beside her in silence. His heart felt like it had been knocked over. It was very complicated. "I know you have always hated me." Shin Luo An's back was facing her. He put his elbows on his legs and covered his face. His voice was a little muffled. He said, "But 2 or 3 years have passed. Manting, we still have to live our lives. I want to make it up to you. Can you give me a chance?" "Give him a chance and give her a chance too." After Shin Luo An's voice fell, there was a long silence in the room. After more than 10 seconds, there was a faint sob behind him. Shin Luo An froze slightly and turned to look. Shin Manting grabbed the quilt and her eyes were full of tears. She looked at Shinluo and with a pitiful face and pouted. Honey, Shinluo, Anne's head was throbbing. Shin Manting rushed to Shinluo and said, Honey, who were you talking to just now? Shinluo and pulled her into his arms and whispered, With you. No, you're not talking to me. Shin Manting whimpered, You never talk to me like that. You're talking to someone else, aren't you? Little Shin Manting's mental age was only 12 years old. But as an orphan she was more sensitive than most adults in certain aspects. Shinluo and held her in his arms. His heart ached when he heard her words. He hugged her gently and lowered his head to kiss away the tears at the corner of her eyes. He whispered, Manting, I'm talking to my Manting. Hubby, Shin Manting hugged him and buried her face in his chest. There's another Manting, isn't there? Shinluo and was stunned and didn't know how to answer. Hubby, that Manting isn't me. I'm Manting. Don't like that Manting, okay? Shin Manting hugged him and looked at him pleadingly. That Manting wants to hate you. He doesn't want to be with you. She said that you're a bad person. I told her that you're not, but she didn't believe me. Shinluo and fell silent. Chapter 2135. Shin Manting's eyes were fixed on Shinluo, and as she spoke, she felt wronged when she saw that he was getting quieter and quieter. She couldn't help but hold Shinluo and tighter and burst into tears. Why aren't you talking? Do you like Shin Manting more and don't want me anymore? Shin Manting hugged him with all her strength and cried uncontrollably, Honey, honey, I'm the one who likes you, not that person. Don't like her, okay? Shinluo An's heart ached when he heard her crying. Her uneasiness and fear were clear to him. Shinluo and hesitated for a moment and hugged her tightly in his arms. He said softly, Don't be silly. I love Manting and I always have. Don't cry or you won't look good. Oh no. Shin Manting was very persistent. She hugged him and shouted, You know it's not me. I'm not her and she's not me. I know, she hates you and you also know that she hates you. Why can't you only like me? Her voice was intermittent with a sobbing tone. Every word was poking at Shinluo An's heart. As Shin Manting hated him. Even little Manting knew that. Why was he still so persistent? Perhaps it was because to him, whether it was the original Shin Manting or the 12-year-old He Yunsuan, they were the same person. Shin Manting cried even harder when she saw that Shinluo and did not speak again. She looked up at the man in front of her, and her little face was already red from crying. She looked at the man in front of her and pulled out her hand to hold his face. Shin Manting directly kissed his lips and clumsily and hurriedly kissed him. Shinluo and did not refuse, nor did he respond. He looked at her calmly and his heart was a little complicated. Shin Manting burst into tears and said, She hates it when I do this to you. She doesn't want me to do this. Then she put her hands around his neck and said, But I like it so much. I like it when you kiss me. Can you kiss me again and hug me again? Shinluo and heard her words and pursed his lips. Shin Manting's body trembled and she sniffed and pretended to cry again. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Looking at him like a child, she said, Hubby, why aren't you talking? Why aren't you answering me? He reached out and gently wiped away the tears on her face. To me you are Shin Manting and Shin Manting is you. I can't treat you as two different people. Manting, you're the mother of my child and you're my wife, he said softly. No. Shin Manting mumbled. She's not your wife. I'm your wife. I love you. She doesn't love you. Don't be fooled. Shinluo An's heart was pierced once again. Shin Manting sobbed. She grabbed his hand and said, I was the one who put this ring on you. I'll put it on for you again at the wedding next month. As long as you don't want Shin Manting to come back, I can continue to stay by your side. Hubby, I beg you, please love me, okay? Shinluo and was taken aback. What do you mean? Chapter 2136. His words were clear and organized. Shin Manting sobbed a little, but she remained calm. She stared into his eyes as if waiting for his decision. Shinluo and was still in a daze and found it hard to believe. In other words, it was a choice between two personalities. If he had chosen the original Manting, little Manting would have been obliterated. What if it was the other way around? If he chose young Manting, then the original Manting, would she never be able to come back? However, Shin Manting was still very serious when she said those words. He had always thought that little Manting was innocent and kind. But in the face of such a moment she could still be so firm and decisive. That's right, in a moment of life and death like this, everyone wanted to survive. This is human nature. Shin Luo and stared at Shin Manting for a long time, then muttered, "Must it be like this?" Shin Manting saw his hesitation and tears rolled down her cheeks again. She looked at Shin Luo and said, "Hubby, do you like her more?" His voice was choked with sobs, filled with confusion and despair. She tugged at Shin Luo's clothes and sniffed. "Why, honey, why?" Little Manting was very puzzled. "I'm the one who loves you. I'm the one who likes you. You like me too. Why did you choose someone else?" Even the door couldn't block out the cries of despair. Yi Qianqian couldn't stand it anymore. She handed Little Moon over to Nanny He and quietly walked to the door of the room to observe what was going on inside. The door was ajar, but it just so happened that it covered the position of the bed. The voice came from the bed. Yi Qianqian stretched out her hand to knock on the door. At that moment she clearly heard Shin Luo An's voice again. Shin Luo An's voice was a little soft, perhaps because he was quite a distance away from her. He said, "I didn't make a choice. To me, Manting is Manting. Manting, be a good girl and don't cry." "No." Shin Manting screamed in a hoarse voice. "I'm not. Hubby, you know I'm not." Shin Luo and fell silent. Shin Manting's sobbing filled the room. She couldn't stand it any longer. She turned around and picked up her phone to call Shinjilia. Shinjilia seemed to be busy. No one picked up the phone. After thinking for a moment, he knocked on the door and said, "Big brother, big sister Lal." Shin Manting's crying subsided a little. "Come in," Shin Luo and said. When Yi Qianqian heard that, her hair stood on end. She had been married to Shinjilia for 2 years, and this was her first time entering Shin Luo An's room. As soon as he walked in, he discovered that Shin Luo An's room was very large. When she walked in, she saw Shin Luo and sitting on the bed and Shin Manting lying on it. Shin Manting's eyes were red and swollen and she looked very pitiful. Yi Qianqian's heart ached. At the same time she was a little afraid. The person in front of her was schizophrenic. What if she took it too hard and stabbed her? I heard that the emotions of mental patients are very unstable. Cough cough. Yi Qianqian walked over and said sheepishly, "Manting, didn't you say that you wanted to take the baby to the amusement park? Little Moon is already urging you to go." Chapter 2137. Wow, he's quite organized. Yi Qianqian thought to herself. She quickly stepped forward and said, "Then you have to apologize to Little Moon. As an adult you have to set a good example." Shin Manting wiped her face and asked, "Are my eyes swollen?" Yi Qianqian nodded subconsciously but immediately shook her head. "They're just a little red." Shin Manting got out of bed, put on her slippers and walked out. Shin Luo An's face was gloomy. He looked at Shin Manting's back and said softly, "Thank you." It was obvious that he was thanking Yi Qianqian. Yi Qianqian waved her hand and said, "There's no need to thank me." But soon she thought of something and said softly, "You have to take care of Manting's emotions. Don't scare the child with her constant changes." Shin Luo and was stunned. He hadn't thought of that. When he heard Yi Qianqian's words, he was deeply convinced. He stood up and was about to go out, but before he could move, he heard Nanny He shouting, "Manting, what are you doing?" Shinjilia's heart skipped a beat. Yi Qianqian was also shocked and quickly ran out. When she went out, Nanny He was holding a fruit in one hand and a knife in the other. She looked at them helplessly and stamped her feet anxiously. "Go after her." Manting ran away with Little Moon in her arms. "Damn it." Yi Qianqian couldn't help but curse. "Damn it. That jinx." A black shadow ran quickly beside her. Shin Luo An's footsteps were very fast and he was soon out of the villa. Yi Qianqian quickly ran after him and took out her cell phone to call Shinjilia. Shin Luo and quickly ran to the left, and Yi Qianqian ran after him. This time the call went through. Shinjilia had just finished a consultation and was taking a sip of water. When he saw his cell phone vibrate, he picked it up and said, "I was busy just now. What's wrong?" "Old Shin, go home quickly." Manting ran away with the child. Shinjilia's heart skipped a beat. What's going on? Shin Manting didn't run far with the child in her arms. When he saw Shin Luo and Yi Qianqian run out, Shin Yueshao couldn't help but open his eyes wide. He looked up at Shin Manting and asked in a childish voice, "Mommy, are we playing hide-and-seek with Daddy?" Shin Manting held the child in her arms and felt an indescribable sense of satisfaction. She hugged the baby tightly and said, "Yes, when you see Daddy later, don't say anything. Mommy can only take you home after Daddy chooses Mommy." Oh. Shin Yueshao didn't really understand. Shin Manting wiped away her tears and crouched through the garden of the villa. She walked out the back door with the baby in her arms. Nanny he was still in shock. She quietly hid at the side and watched Shin Manting leave with the baby. She quickly followed after her. She quietly picked up her phone and dialed Shin Luo, Anne's number. However, it seemed that Shin Luo, Anne didn't bring his cell phone with him, so no one answered. Seeing that Shin Manting was getting further and further away, Nanny he panicked and shouted, "Little Moon, come back." Shin Manting froze when she heard this. When she turned around and saw Nanny he, she quickly picked up Little Moon and ran forward. Seeing this, Nanny he hurriedly chased after her and shouted, "Manting, stop running. Where are you going with Little Moon? Come back." The weather in the imperial capital was still a little cold at this time. Shin Manting was only wearing a thin spring skirt, which made her look very thin. A gust of wind blew and she could only shiver with the baby in her arms. Chapter 2138. Shin Manting looked back. Nanny he's figure was indescribably old. At this moment she was running behind her at a very slow pace and seemed to be struggling. Shin Manting suddenly felt a little sorry for her and kept looking back. When she saw Nanny he following her across the road, she finally couldn't help but shout, "Nanny he, you should go back. I'll go back later. I'm just scaring him." When Nanny he heard this, she suddenly felt relieved. She looked at her with a helpless expression and shouted, "What's the use of scaring him? Come back quickly. Don't catch a cold later." "I'm happy." Shin Manting shouted with a sob in her voice. "I'm feeling uncomfortable. What's wrong with taking our son out for a walk?" Nanny he felt even more helpless when she saw how confident she was. The sun was a little bright. Nanny he squinted and covered her eyes with her hand. He shouted, "Stop running. My old arms and legs can't take it. Come back quickly. Young master will be worried if you catch a cold." No. Shin Manting was very stubborn. She held the baby and pouted. "He doesn't love me." Shin Yueshao saw that his mother was crying and raised his little hand to wipe her eyes. He whispered, "Don't cry, Mommy." Shin Manting felt even more wronged and her tears flowed even more fiercely. She said, "Baby, if Daddy and Mommy aren't together anymore, will you go with Daddy or Mommy?" Little Moon was a little confused and at the same time a little confused. Why would they not be together anymore? He blinked his big dark eyes and asked, "Mommy, did you quarrel with Daddy?" When Shin Manting heard this, her tears suddenly turned into laughter. "I've learned everything from you. You even know what quarreling means." Little Moon didn't quite understand what Shin Manting meant by crying and laughing at the same time, but it seemed that she was praising him. The little fellow waved her arms happily and looked back with a grin. Suddenly, his eyes widened and he shouted, "Daddy." Shin Manting was shocked and turned her head. She saw Shin Luo, and running in her direction. Shin Manting suddenly panicked. She was like a child who had been caught doing something wrong. She was so scared that she burst into tears. She immediately ran forward with the baby in her arms. But Shin Manting was wearing slippers and didn't even wear socks. His feet slipped from the oversized slippers to the ground, and the sharp pebbles pierced his soles. Shin Manting cried out in pain and shouted, "Don't chase me. Don't chase me." But why would Shin Luo and listen? Shin Luo and was 1.8 meters tall and had long arms and legs. Shin Manting couldn't outrun him in the first place. "Daddy." Little Moon stretched out his arms to receive his father's embrace when he saw Shin Luo and carrying him. Shin Luo and was still in a state of shock. He took his son in his arms and checked him from head to toe. He heaved a sigh of relief when he found that there was nothing wrong with him. When he looked down, he saw Shin Manting hugging her feet and crying bitterly. Her cries were not soft and attracted the gazes of the few pedestrians on the street. Shin Luo and had no choice but to squat down and say, "Let me see." Shin Manting cried even more fiercely. She sat on the ground and hugged her feet. She had no intention of responding to him at all. Shin Luo and felt a headache coming on. He didn't allow her to argue. He reached out and pried her hand away, then pulled her feet over. She turned the soles of her feet toward herself. The red bloodstains on the soles of her feet were very eye-catching. Chapter 2139. Even when he said such words, his voice was stiff. Shinmanting cried even louder. She kicked him with her foot and said, "You don't love me anymore. I should have just left with our son. Why did you come out to look for me?" The surrounding wind was a little chilly, and he was worried that his wife and child would catch a cold. But when he heard what his wife said, he suddenly laughed. Shinmanting felt guilty and sobbed a little. She wiped her eyes and said angrily, "What are you laughing at?" "I'm laughing at how cute my wife is." Shinluo, and reached out and rubbed her head. Then he pulled her up and said, "Let's go home. My heart will ache if you freeze." The childish Shinmanting needed to be coaxed. This way of getting along was the most appropriate and harmonious way for them to get along. Shinmanting felt that he was back. She sobbed and stood up. She stretched out her arms, waiting for him to hug her. Shinluo, and smiled and lifted her up in his arms. It was a classic princess carry. Shinmanting wrapped her arms around his neck and suddenly burst out laughing. Shinluo, Anne's heart was filled with tenderness. He looked at the little woman in front of him with a smile and said softly, "You're not angry anymore?" Shinmanting turned her head away, her body trembling as she cried. "Nanny," he finally caught up with them. She panted and shouted, "Young people run fast. Come on little let's go home." Little Moon pouted enviously as he looked at Shinluo and Shinmanting. He also wanted Daddy to hug him. Nanny, he could read the child's mind at a glance. She chuckled and said, "Go home first." Beep beep, the sound of a steam whistle. The familiar Porsche stopped beside them. The window of the driver's seat was rolled down, and Shinjilia's face was revealed. When Shinjilia saw them, he heaved a sigh of relief and said, "Get in the car. Don't catch a cold." Shinluo, and had no objections. He carried his wife to the back seat. Nanny, he carried the little fellow into the front passenger seat. She was only a short distance from home. When she got home, Yi Qianqian was pacing back and forth in front of her house. When she saw that Shinjilia had returned with so many people, she heaved a sigh of relief. After Shinjilia parked the car, Yi Qianqian immediately went up to him and whispered, "Did Big Brother tell you? Faster, thief. You scared me to death." His family's conditions were limited. Shinjilia could only inquire about Shinmanting's condition in Shinluo, Anne's relatively clean and spacious room. After understanding the situation, Shinjilia had a rough idea of the situation. The way he asked the question was very clever. Shinmanting didn't realize that she was being treated as a patient at all. The meeting ended easily. When Shinjilia walked out, Shinluo, and was playing with a new puzzle with his son. The 24-grid map of Huaxia. Shinjilia glanced at it and said, "Brother, come to my room for a while." Yi Qianqian heard it too and quickly stood up. "I'll go too." Shinjilia glanced at it and didn't have any objections. He quickly entered the room. Yi Qianqian was the last to enter. She closed the door behind her and waited for Shinjilia's diagnosis. "How is it?" Shinluo asked. "This situation is rather rare. Sister-in-law seems to understand Sister Manting's emotions very well," she said as she took out a notebook. "Now there are two of them. Let's call them Big Manting and Little Manting." Shinluo and Yi Qianqian looked over. Big Manting doesn't seem to know about Little Manting's existence, but Little Manting is the opposite. She can even predict when she will wake up. Chapter 2140. Hearing this, Yi Qianqian and Shinluo and were shocked. At the same time, Shinluo and felt a chill down his spine. Adult Manting didn't know about Little Manting's existence, but Little Manting could predict when Adult Manting would wake up. Moreover, she kept asking Shinluo and to only love her, so as to erase the existence of Adult Manting. Wasn't she only 12 years old? Why would a 12-year-old girl have such thoughts? One couldn't help but feel fear and trepidation. Seeing Shinluo An's reaction, Shinjilia seemed to have expected it. He tapped on the notebook with a pen and said slowly, "Of course, this is just my speculation. Adult Manting might not necessarily not know about Little Manting's existence. But little Manting's malice towards adult Manting really exists. Shin Luo and said in a low voice, she doesn't want adult Manting to wake up. In fact, this was understandable. However, little Manting seemed to be a little different from what he imagined. It shouldn't be like this. Shin Jilye was silent for a moment and then said, brother, you have to take good care of her. Even if she is only 12 years old, the mentality of an orphan still exists. Shin Luo frowned. Shin Jilye looked at him and slowly said, according to incomplete statistics, most orphans are mentally lonely. They are self-abased, selfish, lonely, and yearn for love and care. There's a difference between adult Manting and young Manting. Sister Manting has lived at home for so many years. Compared to He Yunsuan, her state of mind is different. You can't think about Sister Manting's thoughts and focus them on young Manting. Shin Jilye looked at Shin Luo and waited for his reaction. Shin Luo smiled bitterly. She is also Manting. It's not the same, Shin Jilye said. With split personalities, each person has their own memories, their own personality, and their own thoughts. But between the main personality and the secondary personality, one will be dominant. Hearing this, Shin Luo felt a little uneasy. Yi Qianqian had already guessed something and exclaimed, do you mean that little Manting is now dominant? Shin Luo's heart suddenly sank. Shin Jilye was silent for a moment and nodded. Not necessarily, but based on the current situation, it is only a matter of time before she becomes dominant. Shin Luo had mixed feelings. Brother Big Manting and Little Manting are both Manting, but Big Manting is the real Manting. After saying that, Shin Jilye had no intention of saying anything else. She tugged at Shin Jilye's sleeve and asked, is there no way to level the playing field? Shin Jilye asked. Is there no way to level the playing field? Yes. Shin Jilye looked at Shin Luo calmly. Whoever started the trouble needs to end it. When Shin Luo came out of Shin Jilye's room, he saw Nanny He sitting on the sofa. She was facing the children's toy room, peeling beans. When he saw Shin Luo coming over, he pointed his chin forward and gestured for him to come over. Shin Luo walked to the front and saw Shin Manting and the baby sitting on the ground playing. Shin Manting raised her head when she saw Shin Luo walking over. Her gaze was calm and indifferent. It was very calm. You came. She got up and stroked the baby's head. Play by yourself. Mommy has something to discuss with Daddy. Without a doubt, she was the adult Manting. Shin Luo relaxed slightly and followed her back to the room. Chapter 2141. Shin Luo, Shin Manting said and looked up at him. I just saw the marriage certificate. Shin Luo paused and looked at her. Shin Manting looked up with an indescribable expression on her face and asked, have we registered our marriage? After a long silence, Shin Luo replied, yes. Yes. Shin Manting's face was expressionless. She whispered, what have you done to me in the past 2 years? Manting, I didn't. How could I get married to you? How could I sleep with you? Shin Manting was a little annoyed. She took his hand and walked to the bedside table. She opened the first drawer and took out a row of contraceptive products. There are 10 in a box. There are only 7 here. Shin Luo was silent. Shin Manting continued, this is your house. You can't bring another woman home to spend the night. So when he used it, he must be using it on her. Unbeknownst to her, he had violated her once again. Thinking of this, Shin Manting felt sad. A sense of resistance and grievance followed. Her eyes were sore and tears welled up again. Shin Luo couldn't help but reach out and hold her in his arms. He called her name, Manting. Shin Manting didn't resist. She let him hold her and let her hands fall to her sides. Tears welled up in her eyes. She choked and said, I don't even know when I married you. You are a beast. If I knew, I wouldn't have married you. Beast. When she scolded him, she also used these 2 words. In the past, his heart would be filled with anger. But 3 years had passed. Shin Luo felt nothing but bitterness in his heart. Yes, I am a beast. Shin Luo admitted. But you are already married. He hugged her tighter and whispered, I can't divorce you. For the sake of the child, for the sake of our parents, for the sake of you and me, I can't divorce you. You are my woman in life and my ghost in death. Shin Manting smiled when she heard this. She struggled but couldn't break free. Shen Luo, and made up his mind. He hugged her and said firmly, "We are husband and wife. You can hate me, but the child needs a mother." Shen Manting stopped and tears streamed down her cheeks. "I need you too." Shen Luo, Anne's heart skipped a beat as he spoke. Nervous and restless. But after he said that, he immediately felt enlightened. When he was questioned by young Manting just now, his wavering mind was resolved at this moment. He held her in his arms and said with certainty, "I want you." Only a sober Shen Manting was the real Shen Manting. Little Manting was just an accident. Even though he had done a lot of things to take advantage of others in this accident. But from the beginning to the end, he only regarded her as Shen Manting who had lost her memory. In his eyes she was still herself. Shen Manting was held so tightly that she could even feel the vibration of his chest as he spoke. As soon as he said those 3 words, his mind seemed to be pierced by a scream. Shen Manting felt a little uncomfortable. She reached out and pushed him, saying, "My head hurts." His heart was in a mess in an instant. Anger, grievance, and discomfort immediately assaulted him. Shen Manting was in a trance. She looked at Shen Luo and in front of her and subconsciously resisted such negative emotions. Chapter 2142. There was an indescribable tension in Shen Luo, Anne's voice. Shen Manting could clearly feel it. Her heartbeat was getting heavier and faster. As she watched Shen Luo, Anne's back getting further and further away, her heart gradually became empty. When Shen Luo, Anne led Shen Jiliya over, Shen Manting's consciousness was on the verge of collapse. Shen Luo, Anne came forward to help her up and said, "Manting, wake up. Don't sleep." As he spoke, he gently patted Shen Manting's cheek and shouted, "Wake up." Shen Manting struggled to lift her eyelids, but it seemed that in the depths of her soul, someone was desperately trying to pull her into the darkness. Behind her was a bottomless abyss. Her vision was getting darker and darker. No, she didn't want to go. She didn't want to sleep. There was an inexplicable feeling, strong and clear. She had slept for a long time and she couldn't sleep anymore. Shen Luo, Anne's voice rang in her ears. Shen Manting tried to struggle and raised her hand, but she quickly dropped it. She clearly wanted to reach out her hand, but she suddenly withdrew it. It was her, but it wasn't her. Oh no. Someone was stopping her from touching Shen Luo. And who was it? "He Yuntin, get out of here." A loud shout exploded in her ears like a clap of thunder. Suddenly, Shen Manting felt her heart clench, and in the blink of an eye, she opened her eyes. The feeling of being pulled faded away and her eyes slowly brightened. Only then did she realize that she was gasping for breath. Shen Luo, Anne was holding her, and in front of him were Shen Jiliya and Yi Qianqian. Shen Jiliya's face was pale and somewhat solemn. Yi Qianqian, on the other hand, was surprised and worried. She asked nervously, "Sister-in-law, are you okay?" Shen Manting was stunned. When the voice fell into her ears, it seemed that it had taken several turns in her mind before it triggered her reaction. Shen Manting supported her body with her hands and sat up. She looked at Shen Jiliya and then at Yi Qianqian and shook her head. "I'm fine." The throbbing pain in her head seemed to have subsided, and the pain had dissipated a lot. "Jiliya." Shen Manting looked up and leaned weakly on Shen Luo, and she couldn't sit up straight at all. She looked at Shen Jiliya and asked, "Whose name were you calling just now?" Shen Jiliya looked at Shen Manting and asked, "Do you know who I am?" Shen Manting was stunned. "I know." "Do you know who's behind you?" Shen Manting subconsciously turned her head when she heard that. When she saw him, she asked, "What the hell are you doing?" "There's something wrong with your mind. Do you know that?" Shen Jiliya asked again. "Do you feel strange anywhere? Tell me." Shen Manting vaguely felt something. When she heard this, she was silent for a moment before saying, "Am I a little crazy?" Otherwise, she wouldn't have done so many things with Shen Luo, and without her knowing. If he had been sober, she might have accepted it, but she would not have been so happy. In those vague memories and feelings, she was very cooperative most of the time when they were having sex. That wasn't her. "Yeah," Shen Jiliya replied. "Tell me what you're feeling. Otherwise, you'll be in grave danger." "Is it very dangerous?" Shen Manting raised her eyes. Despite her exhaustion, there was a sharpness in her eyes. "Will I die?" Chapter 2143. Shinjuya's words made Shin Manting feel a little stunned. For a moment she couldn't understand what he meant. After a while she said, brain death. She couldn't think of any other explanation. But as soon as this thought came to her mind, Shin Manting felt flustered. If she was brain dead, it would be better to die directly. She was no longer in a vegetative state. Her body was still breathing, but there was no soul in it. When Shinjuya heard this, he shook his head gently. It's worse than brain death. There are now 2 personalities in your body. Do you know that? Shin Manting was suddenly shocked, and her heart beat faster and heavier. She subconsciously turned to look at Shin Luo and Shin Manting, trying to find a hint of rebuttal or a joke on their faces. But there was none. Not at all. Yi Qianqian seemed a little sad, while Shin Luo pursed his lips and remained silent. Are you saying that I have a split personality? Shin Manting looked at Shinjuya and immediately thought of the strange things that had happened in the past 2 days. Sometimes she was clearly aware that she was sleeping, but her body would send clear senses as if she was moving at night. But she thought she was dreaming. Shin Manting only felt that it was ridiculous and she laughed, but the uneasiness in her heart grew stronger. Looking at their very serious expressions, she asked, Did I faint just now? After being pulled by that huge force, she lost consciousness. It was exactly the same as just now. But at that time she didn't struggle and directly fainted. She thought it was because she was in poor health. She didn't want to resist, so she let it go. Seeing Shinjuya nod, Shin Manting felt even more ridiculous. She laughed and said, Then I had a dream. In the dream I ran out with Little Moon. It was very cold outside and Nanny he chased after me. Then Shin Luo carried me home. I was very happy. As she spoke, Shin Manting noticed that Yi Qianqian and Shin Luo's expressions were a little strange. The 2 of them looked at each other and Yi Qianqian nodded at her and said, These things really happened. You weren't dreaming. An unprecedented fear engulfed Shin Manting. So she had always been in an unhealthy mental state? Dual personality refers to a person's mental state being greatly stimulated. When this mental state is unable to bear it under the great pressure, it will form another personality that is opposed to the original personality. Shinjuya enunciated each word clearly. Logically speaking, you've always existed. You should be the primary personality. Shin Manting was surrounded by fear of the unknown, and her heart was filled with unease. She instinctively held onto his hand. This did not alleviate her fear, but it was better than nothing. However, it's obvious that you haven't been awake for long, or perhaps you don't even know about the existence of another personality. Your position is very dangerous. Her consciousness is stronger than yours and she wants to be the dominant one. She's slowly invading and occupying you. In other words, Little Manting was killing Big Manting bit by bit. Unlike the naivety she displayed, she selfishly obeyed her instincts. Everyone wanted to live, even an accidental personality was no exception. Chapter 2144. But such a dream was too real for her now. Just as she was dreaming, with every touch and every word she could completely feel their appearances. It was true. What they said was true. What should I do? Shin Manting's voice was choked with fear. Am I really going to die? In the face of death, anyone would be instinctively afraid. Moreover, Shin Manting's situation seemed to be worse than death. Shinjuya looked at her and said, There's a way as long as you cooperate. What way? Shin Manting looked at him. If I have to take medicine? Will medicine work in this state? Calm down. Don't be nervous. Shinjuya looked at her. It'll be fine. It was impossible for Shin Manting not to be nervous. At this moment she only felt fear and confusion. She's only 12 years old. Shinjuya's voice seemed to be full of magic. The reason why she can threaten your position is because she took the initiative. She sensed the existence of the opposing personality before you, so it's normal for you to be passive. Shin Manting immediately sat up as if she had grasped a life-saving straw. What do you mean? From now on you already know of her existence. Based on your nearly 30 years of experience, is your mental strength weaker than a 12-year-old girl? No, obviously not. Shin Manting's heart calmed down at this moment, and she secretly heaved a sigh of relief. But soon Shin Manting smiled bitterly. She's me, the 12-year-old me, right? Yes. Then her state of mind won't be weak. Shin Manting looked up. When I was young I was even stronger than when I grew up. But you've grown up. Shin Julia's words were meaningful. But she hasn't. Shin Manting was stunned. She vaguely seemed to understand what he meant. Shin Manting persisted for a long time. Finally she couldn't bear the sleepiness and fell asleep. Shin Luo and lay quietly beside her and gently held her in his arms, silently accompanying her. Drowsiness hit him and Shin Luo and closed his eyes. Just as he was falling asleep the person beside him suddenly moved. Shin Luo and immediately opened his eyes. Shin Manting flipped over and naturally lifted her legs to support his body. She buried her head in his arms. Shin Luo An's heart softened slightly at her intimate behavior. However, at the same time he was also clear. Only young Manting would do that. After keeping his eyes open for a while he couldn't stand it anymore and fell into a deep sleep. After sleeping for an unknown period of time, the person in his arms gently trembled. Shin Luo and subconsciously hugged her tightly, then opened his eyes. Suddenly his eyes met with a pair of pitch-black and bright eyes. Shin Luo and was startled by the sudden appearance of such a pair of eyes in the dim light around him. The person in front of him was obviously shocked by him. She said with some grievance, "Hubby," her weak voice carried the tenderness of a young girl. Shin Luo and heaved a sigh of relief. When he came back to his senses he was already drenched in cold sweat. "When did you wake up?" asked Shin Luo and his voice was a little hoarse as if he had just woken up. Shin Manting wrapped her arms around his waist and said, "I just woke up. Did I scare you?" "A little." At the same time Shin Luo and felt a little upset in his heart. How could she still look so naive? Caven woke up even later. He looked up a bunch of information. "Sleep early everyone." Chapter 2145. How could she still look so naive? She looked just like little Manting a few days ago. He couldn't help but love her. Little Manting pouted and leaned over. She pecked Shin Luo An's lips and said, "Honey, don't you like me anymore?" Shin Luo An's heart trembled. Little Manting was still young, but she was very sensitive to the distance between people. Shin Luo An tried to relax and said softly, "Why not?" Shin Manting smiled happily. She pouted and said, "Kiss me then." "Little dirty girl, you haven't even brushed your teeth." Shin Luo and tapped her nose and then pecked her. "It's still dark. Sleep a little longer." "Well, I won't sleep," Shin Manting said coquettishly and twisted in Shin Luo An's arms. "I want to be with you. It's me, not anyone else." While speaking, Shin Manting hugged Shin Luo An's arm and rubbed her thighs against it. She whispered, "Honey, I miss you so much." Shin Luo An's suppressed desire for a few days was instantly ignited by her gentle teasing. Using his large hands to block her thighs, he pressed his body against hers and pressed her firmly against him. Shin Manting was looking forward to it. Her eyes were shining. She raised her head and kissed him. Her lips fell on his face and made a bo-bo sound. Shin Luo and tilted his head slightly and asked in a low voice, "Aren't your relatives still around?" Shin Manting pouted and said, "But I miss you so much." Her look made Shin Luo An's body even more hot. He turned over and lay down again. He pressed her thighs to prevent her from moving and whispered, "Sleep well. If you provoke me again I'll hit you." "You're shameless to hit a woman." "Bah," Shin Manting said in a low voice. Shin Luo and didn't stand on ceremony. He slapped her butt and said, "Go to sleep." Shin Manting didn't listen to him. She hugged him and touched his body naughtily. Shin Luo and was touched by her. He simply grabbed her hand and pressed it under his body. "If you don't sleep I'll kick you out." Shin Manting didn't show any signs of repentance. She smiled and said, "Sleep. How can I sleep with you like this?" "But when you did it I was also sleeping." Although she didn't sleep very well, she would still close her eyes when she was extremely sleepy. Shin Luo En. He grabbed her hand and restrained her with his thigh. Their bodies were firmly pressed against each other, and Shin Manting couldn't make any more trouble. Shin Manting's eyes gradually darkened as she lay on his chest. Greedily feeling the breath of the man in front of her, little Manting's heart was moved. How blissful! How could such happiness be snatched away by another person? Moreover, this person did not like her husband at all. She had no right to deprive her of everything. Even if she was the grown-up version of herself. Shin Luo, and didn't open his eyes, but he knew that she was awake. Fortunately, she didn't make any strange movements. The night passed peacefully. When Shin Luo and woke up, it was already bright outside. The woman in his arms still maintained that position, breathing evenly. Shin Luo and gently loosened his grip. As he moved, Shin Manting also opened her eyes at the same time. When she saw Shin Luo An's face, she seemed a little startled. Then she calmed down and said, "Morning." Shin Luo and smiled bitterly when he saw her attitude. He could actually recognize who was who between them. Chapter 2146. After maintaining the same posture for a long time, Shin Manting's body felt a little stiff. He stretched out his hand with some difficulty and moved it a little. Just as he twisted his neck, a large hand was placed on his shoulder. His warm palm pressed on her shoulder, neither too lightly nor too heavily. Shin Manting was flattered and her heartbeat quickened. Shin Manting was a little embarrassed, so she shrugged her shoulders and said softly, "There's no need." Shin Luo and didn't let go and asked, "Is it sour here?" "I'm getting up." "Or here." Shin Luo and pressed his palm against her waist again. Shin Manting was on her period, so she wasn't feeling well. Being pressed like this, she felt so comfortable that her eyes narrowed. So she just let him be and closed her eyes to enjoy it. Shin Luo and continued massaging and pinching her arm with the same amount of force. Shin Manting flinched and whispered, "It's ticklish." Her soft voice was like a feather brushing past his heart. Shin Luo An's heart softened. Not only did he not stop, but he pinched her twice more mischievously. Shin Manting couldn't help laughing and said, "Stop fooling around. Get up." Perhaps even Shin Manting herself didn't realize how charming she was at that moment. Shin Luo An's heart fluttered. He pulled her into his arms and asked softly, "Do you feel uncomfortable?" "No." Shin Manting squirmed. "Let go of me. I'm going to the bathroom." Shin Luo and finally released her. She immediately got up and ran to the bathroom barefoot. Shin Manting closed the door. She could clearly sense that she was acting strangely. He seemed to be different from before. Shin Luo and hadn't done anything overboard, but her heart was pounding. It must be because of young Manting. She knew that little Manting liked Shin Luo and very much, but she didn't expect her to like him to this extent. She was actually affected as well. Caught off guard, it permeated naturally. After washing up, Shin Manting changed her sanitary pad. Only then did she realize that her period was almost over. For a moment she was in a trance. It felt like a long time had passed since he woke up. There were so many things to struggle with in his mind that even time seemed to slow down. When they came out, Shin Luo and walked in with his son. Shin Yueshao was petite. His chubby little face and big dark eyes were exactly the same as hers. When he saw her, his little face immediately bloomed into a smile and he shouted, "Mama." Shin Yueshao shook off his father's hand and threw himself into Shin Manting's arms. Shin Manting picked him up with a smile and asked, "What's wrong?" "Mommy, ride the wooden horse." The little guy simply expressed what he wanted, and his eyes were full of beautiful brilliance. "Daddy will go too." Shin Manting's lips curled into a smile and she couldn't help but kiss the little boy on the cheek. But soon she looked at Shin Luo and asked, "Can I?" She knew her situation. She couldn't completely control her consciousness and body. If she took the baby out, it would be dangerous. However, she had already stood the baby up once yesterday. If she did it again today, it wouldn't be good for the child's education. It is said that one can judge one's age at 3. For a child, the best time to shape his personality was before the age of 3. Chapter 2147. Little Moon was still young, but he understood what his father meant. She pouted her lips and said unhappily, "All right." Shin Luo and felt a little sorry for him. He rubbed his little head and said, "Daddy will buy you some marshmallows later." The little boy's eyes immediately lit up and he said, "Okay." Shin Luo and had been exhausted recently. He felt that it had been a long time since he took the child out to play. Shin Manting was wearing a skirt and a coat. She held her son's hand and stood in front of the marshmallows stall with Shin Luo, watching the marshmallows being made with her son. The little boy was particularly engrossed. When the red and green marshmallows were ready, he immediately jumped up and shouted, "Hooray!" Shinmanting took it and handed it to him. Little Moon held it in his hand with satisfaction, his little face smiling. Shinluo and handed Shinmanting a small bamboo stick. She quickly understood and used the small bamboo stick to dig out the marshmallows and fed them to the little boy. However, Little Moon was greedy and couldn't help but stick out his tongue to lick the marshmallows. Soon his little face was covered with sticky marshmallows. "It's dirty. Slow down." Shinmanting bent down and looked at him helplessly. However, her temperament was completely different from when Shinmanting was in charge. At this moment, the atmosphere was so strong that even Shinluo and could clearly feel her love for the child. After all, little Manting was still a child. Perhaps she knew that this was her son, but in her consciousness, after all, it didn't come from her body, so the feeling was not as strong as it was for Shinmanting. Shinmanting fed the little boy candy carefully and patiently. It was such a simple and boring process, but Shinluo and was fascinated by it. It wasn't until the candy was almost finished that Shinmanting realized something was wrong. She looked up and saw Shinmanting looking at her with tenderness in her eyes. Her heart skipped a beat and she immediately straightened up and asked, "What's wrong?" Shinluo and shook his head gently and said, "Let's go to the park with the baby." The park was not far from home. There was a hand-turned wooden horse inside and many children were willing to play there. Shinluo and picked up the little boy and said, "Daddy will take you to ride the wooden horse." Shin Yuexiao's big eyes lit up. "Thank you, Daddy." "Wipe it first. Sticky." Shinluo and reached out to Shinmanting. Shinmanting immediately reacted and took out a pack of wet tissues. It was a completely subconscious action. Shinmanting pulled out a wet tissue and handed it to him before she realized that something was wrong. It was too natural. It was as if he had experienced this countless times and it had become a habit. It was little Manting. Shinmanting felt a little upset. It was as if something that belonged to him had been violated. It was a very uncomfortable feeling. After wiping the little girl's face, he turned around and noticed that something was wrong with her. "What's wrong?" he asked. Shinmanting shook her head. "Let's go." When they arrived at the park, there were already many children running around. Boys and girls played together in groups of 3 to 5. Parents brought their children to play in the park. There were old people and young couples. Shin Yuexiao was in high spirits and struggled to get out of his father's arms. He ran excitedly to the merry-go-round and turned to call out to Shinluo, "Dad." Shinluo and carried him up and said, "Hold on tight. The merry-go-round is about to move." He then looked at Shinmanting and said, "Mommy, let's play together." Chapter 2148. Shinmanting's lips curled into a smile at her precious son's sincere invitation. But she quickly rubbed the little boy's head and said, "Mommy is an adult. You can't play here. This is for children." "But Mommy used to play here." "That's different. There are adults in the amusement park, but there are only children here." "Oh." Shin Yuexiao didn't quite understand, but he was soon pushed around by Shinluo, and giggles could be heard endlessly, and there were also the sounds of other children giggling around. Shinmanting looked at her son in front of her and couldn't help smiling. But the sounds around her seemed to be getting farther and farther away. Everything in front of her was white. She was in a daze. She turned her head and reached out to grab Shinluo and looked at her sideways and asked, "What's wrong?" Shinmanting's vision was getting whiter and whiter, and her consciousness seemed to be dragged by someone. She opened her mouth but couldn't speak. Then her vision darkened and her whole body softly fell into his arms. Shinmanting didn't know what was wrong with her. She was surrounded by dazzling whiteness. After walking for an unknown amount of time in a daze, he finally saw a small figure. She was thin and sallow. She was 12 years old, but she looked like she was only 10 years old. She was wearing the leftover clothes of the other brothers and sisters in the orphanage. They were washed white and looked a little dirty. Hyunsuin sat in the corner and stared blankly at the little thing that she didn't know what it was. She seemed to notice her arrival and raised her head to look at her. Shinmanting saw herself when she was 12 years old, and her feelings were indescribably complicated. Hyunsuin walked over slowly and smiled at her. "You're here. I've been waiting for you for a long time. Shin Manting looked at him and the surroundings were distorted again. She knew that she was dreaming. This kind of dream was different from the days when the body was dominated by another personality. It was completely random and unorganized. But at the same time she also knew that this was another personality trying to communicate with her and meet her. So she saw Hyunsuin. The surrounding environment changed again and again, and she seemed to return to a very young age in the orphanage, secretly drawing on the wall with her good friend Zhang Meifeng. When the dean found out, he stomped his feet and flew into a rage. He looked for a stick everywhere and tried to beat someone up. The two little girls ran away in fear and amusement. Their eyes were filled with laughter after the prank. After an unknown amount of time, she was suddenly pressed against the washstand and ravaged. Shinluo An's face was filled with lust. She felt a dull pain in her heart and she retreated. The scene changed again. She was pinned under the man's body and the room was completely dark. She could hear the man's low panting and sighing beside her ear. His voice was almost sorrowful as he repeated, "Manting, I love you. Manting, don't hate me." His body was in pain and his heart was twitching. Suddenly, the voice in her ears disappeared and a huge force pushed her down. In front of her was Hyunsuin's young face, almost twisted with hatred and madness. She said, "Go to hell. You thief. Die. Die. Die." Shin Manting felt as if she was standing on the edge of a cliff. She was suddenly pushed down and her whole body trembled. When he opened his eyes, everything was dark. His body was already drenched in sweat. Chapter 2149. Shin Manting was in a trance. She listened to the sound in her ears and stared at the darkness above her head. After a long time she suddenly came to her senses. She turned her head and saw that Shinluo An was looking at her with tears in his eyes. His large palm brushed across her face and she felt a cool sensation on her face. Shin Manting realized that she had already burst into tears. Shinluo An hugged her and whispered, "You slept for a long time and it's already early in the morning." Miraculously, Shin Manting's heart was calm at this moment. She gently placed her palm on his arm and asked, "Did little Manting wake up?" As she spoke, Shin Manting suddenly realized that her throat was terribly hoarse. It was dry and painful like the price of screaming hysterically. Shinluo An didn't know what to say so he whispered, "I'll get you a glass of hot water." "Yes," Shin Manting replied and watched as he got up and got out of bed. She propped herself up and sat up, feeling a little urgent. She got up and found that her whole body was sore and weak. She wanted to get out of bed but she barely had enough strength. Shin Manting found her slippers. Her footsteps were light and she moved very slowly. She was on the verge of collapsing as if she could directly lie down in the next second. When Shinluo An came in with the water, he saw Shin Manting standing and was shocked. He quickly came forward to support her. Shin Manting leaned softly in his arms and took the water from his hand. After drinking a lot of it, she felt a little better. Looking at his red eyes, she couldn't help but ask, "What's wrong with me?" Shinluo An shook his head and put the cup aside. "Do you want to go to the toilet?" "Yes." Shin Manting felt a little embarrassed. "Help me there, I'll do it myself." Shinluo An did as he was told. After hearing the sound of water being flushed, he turned around to help her. "I don't have any strength," Shin Manting said in a low voice. "How did this happen?" "There are some side effects from the injection just now." Shinluo An directly carried her in his arms. "Sleep a little longer." Shin Manting didn't object. She squinted her eyes and still felt a little sleepy. However, after experiencing the dream, she didn't dare to sleep again. Looking at Shinluo An, who was obviously not right, Shin Manting asked again, "What's wrong with me?" Shinluo An was silent for a moment before he said, "Little Manting came out this afternoon." Shin Manting seemed to have expected it. She wanted to commit suicide. Shinluo An closed his eyes, looking extremely exhausted. Shin Manting's heart skipped a beat. She immediately thought of the hoarse and resentful words she heard in her dream, "Go to hell." She wanted to commit suicide, but it was her body that died. Because he couldn't get it, he decided to destroy it. Shin Manting still had a lingering fear in her heart. She held Shinluo An's hand and asked, "And then?" "It didn't work. I asked Julia to give you an injection," Shenluo, and said as he caressed her face. You'll get better. There's already a way to control little Manting's mental strength. You'll get better slowly. However, they could no longer stay at home. What happened today had scared the elderly and the children. Shenluo, and kissed her gently on the cheek and said softly, we may need to move. Where to? I have a house in Nanshan district. It's in the suburbs and close to Jilya's hospital. Let's go there, shall we? Is that all right? He asked softly, but she didn't know which word he said stung her eyes. Shin Manting's tears rolled down in an instant, but she quickly forced them back. Chapter 2150. It took less than 3 days to move to the new house. The house wasn't big, but it was quiet. There were 3 bedrooms and 2 living rooms, and the decoration was cool, revealing a man's taste and toughness. Shin Manting walked in and straightened out her clothes in the master bedroom's cloakroom. She and Shin Luoan's clothes. Yi Qianqian and Shin Jilya also moved in together, so that Yi Qianqian could accompany her and keep an eye on Shin Manting's condition. Shin Jilya had always been taking care of Shin Manting's condition, so he had no intention of changing doctors. He only occasionally asked Luo Ran to take a look. Shin Manting tidied up her clothes and was making the bed in the room when she heard the door open. Shin Luoan was back. Inexplicably, Shin Manting felt a sense of satisfaction. It was like a normal wife waiting for her husband to come home. It was wonderful and happy. Hearing the sound of plastic bags outside, Shin Manting made the bed and walked out. Shin Luo, and was washing rice and cooking. When he saw her come out, he asked, "Are you done?" "Not yet." Shin Manting walked over and glanced at the vegetables he had bought. "There are still some things that haven't been cleaned up, but they can be done later." Shin Manting took out the fresh ingredients and put them directly on the edge of the sink. She slowly began to tidy them up. Shin Luo and saw the smile on her lips and felt a little strange. He asked tentatively, "Are you happy today?" Shin Manting quickly suppressed the corners of her mouth and said, "It's all right." Shin Luo and didn't say anything. He poured the rice into the new pot and asked, "Is it because you moved to a new house?" Shin Manting couldn't help but smile and said, "Well, that's one of the reasons." He stopped asking and helped her to tidy up the ingredients. Shin Manting's mood was better than it had been in the past few days. She smiled unconsciously and asked casually, "When will Jilya and Qianqian move in?" "Tomorrow. I have to go to the laboratory tomorrow. Lao Wu can't handle it anymore," Shin Luo and said in a soft voice. "I have a lot of things to do and they are waiting for me to take over." "Well, will Qianqian come tomorrow?" "I'll leave when she comes." "Okay." Shin Manting looked sideways and whispered, "When will you come back?" Shin Luo and was obviously very surprised. After staring blankly for a while, he curled his lips and said, "I'll come back once I'm done." Shin Manting turned her head away and her cheeks were a little red. She seemed unhappy and said, "It's as good as not saying anything. It won't take long. It shouldn't be a big deal. One afternoon should be enough." Shin Luo and inched closer to her and called out, "Manting." Shin Manting was washing vegetables. She lowered her head and responded, "Look up." Shin Manting subconsciously raised her head when she heard his words. The corners of Shin Luo and's lips curled up. He quickly lowered his head and kissed the corner of her lips gently. Shin Manting's smile widened, but she didn't say anything. After washing the vegetables, she went to prepare the other ingredients. Shin Luo and felt at ease. When she finished processing the ingredients in her hands, he chased her inside. He was the backbone of the kitchen. With Nanny he at home, Shin Luo and was in charge of the family's food. He was used to not having to worry about food and clothing since he was a child, so he rarely had the opportunity to enter the kitchen. His culinary skills were all learned from watching Shin Jilya cook for Yi Qianqian. The taste wasn't as good as Shin Jilya's, but it wasn't too bad and was still acceptable. After finishing the last dish, he served it on the dining table. Chapter 2151. Shin Luoan's heart was in his throat. His body reacted faster than his brain. He immediately rushed to the door of the room and saw Shin Manting looking at the cabinet on the floor helplessly. The bedside table, which had been placed properly, suddenly fell to the ground. Everything on it fell to the ground. Fortunately, there was no glass or anything that was broken. Shin Luo, and stepped forward to support Shin Manting. What happened? Shin Manting was a little confused and said, I think little Manting came out just now. Shin Luo, and gently pulled her into his arms and whispered, and then she toppled the cabinet. I didn't want her to do it, so I came back on my own. Shin Manting hugged him. It was so scary. Don't be afraid. We're fine now, aren't we? Shin Luo, and comforted her softly. Wash your hands first and eat. We'll come back later. Okay, Shin Manting replied quickly. For some reason Shin Luo, and felt a little strange. He couldn't tell what was strange about it, but there seemed to be something wrong somewhere. He held Shin Manting's hand as they walked out and washed their hands together. Then he scooped a bowl of rice for both of them. Shin Manting took it and ate slowly with the chopsticks. He seemed to be especially fond of that plate of crispy fried ribs. Shin Luo, and glanced at it and asked, How is it? It's delicious, Shin Manting replied. She glanced at him and said, But Nanny, he's cooking is still the best. Shin Luo, Anne's heart sank when he heard this. Without batting an eyelid, he nodded and said, Then I will improve next time. Shin Manting didn't say another word. The rest of the journey was very quiet. Shin Luo, and was preoccupied with his own thoughts. After dinner he glanced at Shin Manting and said, I won't be able to see my son for some time. I've arranged for him to go to kindergarten in September. I'm not sure if he'll be able to get used to it. Of course he can, Shin Manting said with certainty. Little Moon is the smartest child I've ever met. By September he'll probably be better than all the other children. Yes, Shin Luo, and replied, but his mood was low. He casually said, I think so too. A smile appeared on Shin Manting's face. After she finished eating, she cleared the dishes and went to the kitchen to wash the dishes. Shin Luo, Anne's heart sank as he watched her busy figure in the kitchen. He sent Shin Jilia a WeChat message. Jilia. Jilia? Shin Luo, and little Manting is out. Shin Jilia was still packing up when he saw those words. His heart skipped a beat and he immediately asked, What's the situation now? Shin Luo, she's pretending to be the adult Manting. Jilia. Shin Jilia was a little confused. What does it mean to pretend to be an adult? After a long pause he said, Do you have violent tendencies? Shin Luo, not yet. Jilia, hang in there. Qian and I will be there tomorrow. When he put his phone away, Shin Manting had already come out of the kitchen. What are you busy with? Shin Manting asked casually as if she didn't care about it. He put down his phone and walked over to her. He hugged her gently and said, I'm looking up information. What information? How to decorate a happy nest. Shin Manting blushed slightly and hugged him. Okay, let's investigate it together. Let's go and clean up the room. Shin Luo, and gently kissed her forehead. Little Manting is too naughty. What's so fun about the bedside table? Chapter 2152. Probably, Shin Luo, and said with a sigh. You're right. I'm sorry. Shin Manting didn't expect him to say that. She was lost in thought for a moment and then said, There's nothing to be sorry about. She appeared later. First come, first served, don't you think so? Her eyes were slightly warm as she said that. She let go of him and walked into the room with her back to him. Shin Luo, and looked at her back and didn't see anything strange about her. However, one could also feel the desolation of being abandoned. Shin Luo, and followed her and said softly, There's no such thing. Big Manting is Manting and little Manting is Manting. In my opinion they're the same. Shin Manting had her back to him and he couldn't tell what she was feeling. She picked up the things scattered on the floor and didn't make a sound. Shin Luo, and went forward and lifted the bedside table that had fallen down. He said slowly, They're both Manting and the women I love. I'm the least qualified person to favor one and discriminate against the other. Shin Manting couldn't help but look up at him. Her eyes were even more warm. Shin Luo, and turned his back to her and said, Manting, I love you and her. I don't want you to kill each other. I want you to be well. However, that was impossible. Only one of them could exist. It had to be the big one or the little one. Shin Manting stood up with the things in her arms and said, You know it's impossible. It's possible, Shin Luo, and said softly. You're the same person. Why can't you live together? Shin Luo, and turned around and said softly, Manting, you're kind. Little Manting was very simple and naive when she was a child. Although her mood has been a little unstable recently, it's only because her existence is threatened. This is human nature. Shin Manting listened to his words and silently put the things back on the bedside table. Shin Luo and gently hugged her from behind and whispered, "But she may not know how important you are to me." Shin Manting's body stiffened slightly. "You were with me when I was most depressed," Shin Luo said softly. "And after you slept in the hospital for 2 years, it was little Manting who was by my side and accompanied me through the lowest point. No one can replace her." Shin Manting didn't say anything, but her eyes were filled with tears. She reached out and put her hand on his hand, which was holding her, and said in a choked voice, "What if you have to choose one of the two?" Shin Luo and leaned against her neck and pretended not to notice her strange behavior. He seemed to be thinking about it and said, "Why do we have to choose? If we choose, the outcome will be a lose-lose situation." "But this is a lose-lose situation. Everyone wants to survive." Shin Luo. Shin Manting called out his name, but in her heart she had an even greater desire to call him hubby. She hugged his hand and turned her head away. She wanted to kiss him. However, it seemed that Elder Manting would not do so. Although she was gentle now, she still resisted her husband's touch. She stared at him for a long time, but in the end she did not raise her head. Unexpectedly, Shin Luo reached out and held her chin. He lowered his head and kissed her lips softly. Shin Manting couldn't hold it in any longer and tears rolled down her cheeks. She wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him while sobbing. Chapter 2153. It was as if he hadn't touched her for a long time. Pressing her under his body, Shin Luo's desire poured out from the depths of his body. Shin Manting hugged him, her hands eagerly fumbled for the corner of his clothes and lifted his clothes. The two of them were entangled and rolled around each other instinctively. The moment Shin Luo entered, Shin Manting hugged him contentedly and couldn't help but cry out, "Honey, I love you too." Shin Luo gently kissed the corner of her lips. "No matter who you are, I love you. I only love you." Shin Manting suddenly realized that she seemed to have been exposed. She looked down at Shin Luo, and it was obvious that he already knew. An indescribable emotion suddenly filled her body. But before she could open her mouth to say anything, her body was like a wave floating up and down with him. Tears flowed from the corner of her eyes, and Shin Manting climbed onto his waist. The world seemed to have gone far away, and there was only one sentence left in her mind: "I love you, I only love you." In the middle of the night, Shin Manting woke up with an extremely unbearable feeling. The man who appeared in her countless nightmares, once again pressed her under his body. Shin Manting couldn't tell what she was feeling, but she followed his movements and let go of herself, moaning happily. Shin Luo kissed her softly and whispered, "Is it you?" At the same time she sank heavily and Shin Manting groaned as if the softest place in the depths of her heart was suddenly hit by him. She grabbed his shoulders with both hands and said intermittently, "It's me." Shin Luo slightly stiffened, but Manting under him not only didn't resist, but also gave a more skillful response than little Manting. The night was lingering. When it was over, the sky was already bright. Shin Manting was so tired that she fell into a deep sleep, but Shin Luo still held her and looked at her. After a long time he suddenly smiled, closed his eyes and fell asleep. The next day he was woken up by the doorbell. He looked at the time and it was 10:18 in the morning. Shin Luo was so sleepy that he didn't even take a shower last night. Now that he got out of bed, Shin Luo felt dizzy walking. Firstly, he didn't have enough sleep. Secondly, he was almost squeezed dry. He casually put on some casual clothes and got up to open the door. When Shin Jilya saw the expression on Shin Luo's face, he immediately tugged at his wife and said, "Brother, hurry up and go inside. You're affecting the city's appearance." Shin Luo Yi Qianqian was a little dazed. Before she could recover her wits, Shin Luo had already walked inside. Shin Jilya and Yi Qianqian moved on their own. Actually, they didn't have many things. They just needed to put their clothes and toiletries in the bag and everything else would be taken care of. The couple glanced at the closed door of the master bedroom and kindly decided not to disturb it. After diligently buying groceries, they even rang the doorbell once. It was Shinluo, and again. He still had the sleepy expression on his face. Shinjilia and Yi Qianqian clicked their tongues. Yi Qianqian whispered, "Big brother was really intense last night." Shinjilia replied, "I can tell." "Hey." As Yi Qianqian washed the vegetables, she muttered, "I'm so jealous." Shinjilia asked, "What do you mean by that?" Yi Qianqian snorted. "That's exactly what I meant." Chapter 2154. Tisk, Yi Qianqian said in disdain. Paper tiger. Ever since the miscarriage he didn't dare to do anything to her. Especially since she had been taking Chinese medicine recently, the old Chinese doctor had repeatedly reminded her that she must be careful during sex. Careful during sex, careful during sex, careful during sex, and must not get pregnant during this period of time. As a result, Yi Qianqian was forced to abstain from sex. In the past, Shinjilia's needs in that regard. Apart from when she could rest during her period, she would always beg him to let her go. Later on, she became the one who took the initiative. Not only did Shinjilia restrain himself, but he was also extremely gentle. Once or twice a week. After that, she went to take a shower. The gap is a little big. Tiandahi's heart was ablaze with anger. He placed his hands on either side of her body and gritted his teeth as he said, "Wasn't I taking care of your body?" Yi Qianqian pursed her lips and didn't say anything. Unexpectedly, Shinjilia picked her up by her legs and hung her up with his thighs against the wall. He lowered his head and kissed her on the lips. His wet palms rubbed against her body as if he was ravaging her in revenge. Yi Qianqian felt a little pain from the rubbing. She reached out and pushed him away. "Ouch. It hurts." His voice was muffled, but in this small space the ambiguous atmosphere overflowed. Ding ding, the sound of a key. It was obvious that someone had done it on purpose. Shinjilia froze and turned to look. Yi Qianqian immediately returned to her senses and pushed him away. When she saw Shinluo, and standing at the door, she blushed. He quickly turned around and continued to wash the vegetables, pretending that nothing had happened. Shinluo threw the key on the table and said, "Don't press the doorbell anymore. Open the door yourself next time." "Also," Shinluo glanced at him, "remember to return to your room next time. You're affecting the city's appearance." What a joke, he was the owner of the house. He hadn't tried cooking in the kitchen yet. Yi Qianqian's back was facing them as she washed the vegetables. When she heard this, her face turned even redder. After Shinluo left, she kicked Shinjilia. "It's all your fault. Don't provoke me." Shinjilia bent over and pressed his forehead against hers. He warned her softly, "Otherwise I'll show you why the sun is so red." F***C. By the time she finished cooking, Shinluo and Shinmanting had already washed up and came out of the bathroom. It was exactly 12:30. Shinmanting was wearing a thin white sweater with a high collar and a smile on her face. It was the kind of mature and intelligent smile, indescribably charming and amorous. Without a doubt, she was the adult Manting. One look and you can tell that it's Jilia's cooking. Shinmanting took the rice from Yi Qianqian and smiled. "We should be the ones cooking. Let me make dinner." "Who's being polite?" Shinjilia glanced at her. "You're acting like you don't know me. You can continue eating. Remember to wash the dishes when you're done." "Don't listen to him." Yi Qianqian took a bite of meat and mumbled, "I'll do it later." "You can't do it." Shinjilia glanced at her with resentment in his eyes. "I have something to do later." Yi Qianqian was speechless. Yi Qianqian's face reddened all the way to her ears. She raised her leg and kicked him under the table. However, he didn't manage to kick her and was sandwiched in the middle. Yi Qianqian tried to pull away but failed. She glared at him resentfully. Shinmanting looked at them and asked, "Did you quarrel?" Shinluo's heart was as clear as a mirror. He picked some food for Shinmanting and said, "Don't mind them. Spring is here." Yi Qianqian immediately lowered her head. Chapter 2155. After dinner, Yi Qianqian took her cell phone and was about to run away. She didn't expect that she would be pulled back before she could walk out of the door. Bang! The door was slammed shut. Yi Qianqian was filled with regret. "Sob, I was wrong, okay?" Shinmanting only came back to her senses when she saw Yi Qianqian being pulled back into the room by Shinjilia. Feeling a little embarrassed, she lowered her head and continued to clean the dishes. At the same time, she felt a little envious. Enchanting was really happy to be married to Shinjilia. Although he was not very serious at times, he had a way of dealing with people and had always been very popular. Unlike Shinluo, who was a taciturn person, perhaps geniuses were always more taciturn. Shin Manting subconsciously glanced at Shinluo, who was also cleaning up with a smile in her eyes. "What are you looking at?" Shinluo squinted and asked softly, "Haven't you seen enough?" "What are you talking about?" Shin Manting looked disgusted, but she couldn't hide the smile on her lips. "I'm going to wash the dishes. Cut some fruit and leave it there." Julia bought some fruit and put it in the fridge. "Okay." While the couple on the outside was working together, the couple on the inside was already in perfect harmony. Shinjilia was very impatient. Before he even finished taking off his clothes, he pressed her down on the bed and kissed her. Enchanting was scared and excited. After a symbolic struggle, she began to move her hands and feet. Shinjilia moved his mouth away from her lips and heard Enchanting panting and saying dirty things. She said, "Honey, take off your pants." "Old Shin, why the hell aren't you coming in yet? Are you dying?" F*Z. "Can't you F*King let me prepare myself?" Gently. Shinjilia had no intention of letting her go. He moved fiercely and gritted his teeth. "I haven't beaten you for a few days. Are you itching?" Enchanting didn't deny it. She hugged him tighter and shouted, slowly, "Ah." After they were done, Enchanting got up and grabbed Shinjilia's hand. She said anxiously, "Did you not take any safety precautions just now?" Shinjilia said, "I forgot." "Ah, then what should we do?" Enchanting was a little flustered. She shook his arm. "The doctor said that we can't get pregnant for the time being." Shinjilia pulled her over and pinned her down with his upper body. He gently licked and kissed her as he whispered, "What are you afraid of? We've only been struck once in 2 years. This is the only time we didn't wear it. I reckon we'll be fine." When she heard that, Enchanting actually felt that it made sense. As she accepted his kiss, her breathing gradually became heavier. She said, "What if it's true? If I'm pregnant, I'll give birth. I can't wait to get pregnant." Shinjilia leaned over her again. "Old Chinese medicine doctor only said that it's possible. That means it's an extremely low probability. Besides, your period should be coming soon." Enchanting replied, "You really know it better than I do." "Of course," Shinjilia said proudly. "I'm your husband." Again. "I think I should wear one. I didn't buy it. I still have what I bought last time. I didn't bring it." Ugh. When they were done, Enchanting leaned against the headboard and began to doubt her life. She nudged her husband and asked, "Do you have a cigarette?" Shinjilia asked, "Why do you want a cigarette?" "Hey, didn't they say that a cigarette makes you as happy as a deity after sex? I'm trying to see if this thing can numb you a little. That way I'll be mentally prepared the next time you go crazy." Shinjilia replied, "Would I go crazy if you didn't provoke me?" Chapter 2156. Shinjilia replied, "Would I have gone mad if you hadn't provoked me?" Enchanting was indignant. "Would I have provoked you if you hadn't gone overboard?" How is that too much?" Shinjilia raised his eyebrows. His large hands moved closer and began to grope her. "Tell me about it." Enchanting dodged, but she still couldn't escape his claws. She asked, again. "I've been saving up the public grain for a long time." Shinjilia bowed. "It's better to hand it over all at once." Enchanting exclaimed, "Wake up, young man. This is your brother's house." Shinjilia chuckled and pinched her cheek. "Get up and go take a shower." "Yes, yes, yes." Shin Manting was in a surprisingly good state today. Shin Luo had already gone to the laboratory. She was sitting alone in the living room cutting paper. She suddenly heard the sound of the door opening. She looked up and saw Shinjilia walking out. He was in high spirits and his face was beaming with happiness. When Shin Manting saw his expression, she couldn't help but smile and ask, "Why are you so happy?" Shinjilia sat down and looked at the paper in front of her. "Why are you playing with this again?" "I had nothing better to do, so I came to cause trouble." Shin Manting glanced behind her. "Where's Qian?" He's inside. He doesn't want to come out, Shinjilia replied vaguely. How's the situation recently? Shin Manting's smile faded. She lowered her eyes to look at the pattern she had cut in her hands and said softly, I think I can talk to little Manting now. When Shinjilia heard that, he looked at her with a straight face. She doesn't have any bad intentions, Shin Manting said slowly as she stared at her paper cut. She wants to be with Luo, and then live happily ever after. Her previous resistance, suicide, and running away were all because she wanted to force Luo, and to compromise. Last night young Manting sneaked out and pretended to be her. When she heard what Shin Luo and said, she couldn't hold on any longer. You look fine now, Shin Jishua said. Yes, Shin Manting replied in a low voice. Little Manting is also conscious. Shinjilia froze and looked at her. What do you mean? She's also awake now, but she can only watch. You've regained control? Yes. Rather than taking it back, it would be more accurate to say that little Manting had voluntarily given it up. She put down the scissors and touched the ring on the ring finger of her left hand. She said, After all, I'm married and have a child. No matter how unwilling I used to be, I have to face reality. Therefore she decided to accept him. Little Manting must have played a part in it, but Big Manting must have figured it out on her own. Or perhaps, unknowingly, the two of them had slowly merged into one, and there was no distinction between you and me. Sister-in-law, Shinjilia called out. The wedding is next month. There's no change. Yes. Shin Manting smiled gently, and her face seemed to be shrouded in a layer of hazy light. That must be a wedding worth looking forward to. Shinjilia looked at her calmly. His emotions were complicated as he replied, Yeah. Shin Luo, and realized that in the next few days, little Manting rarely appeared. Most of the time she interacted with him as an adult. But occasionally, the coquettish demeanor of a little girl would vaguely resemble that of young Manting. Chapter 2157. When Shinjilia got married, the wedding was very grand. It was a traditional Chinese wedding, and every procedure was in accordance with the customs of the Qing dynasty. But after more than 2 years, old Madame Dongfang, who had organized Shinjilia's wedding, was not as healthy as before. Old Madame Shin was a little regretful. After thinking about it, she left it to Shinjilia to decide. When Shin Manting was asked this question, she thought for a moment and said, I want to wear a wedding dress. As she said this, she smiled brightly. I look like a princess. It's very beautiful. Her innocent and frank tone was filled with happiness. Shin Luo and smiled and quickly agreed. The wedding was grand and there were many traditional elders in the family. Shin Luo and Shin Manting had slept separately 3 days before the wedding. There were many people who came to attend the wedding. Shin Manting was so nervous that she couldn't sleep. The next day she was dressed up with dark circles under her eyes. When they were led onto the stage, the MC asked Shin Luo, and in a slow and joyful voice, Mr. Shin Luo, are you willing to marry this young lady in front of you and promise that you'll be faithful to her for better or for worse, in sickness or in health? Shin Luo gazed deeply at Shin Manting and said sincerely, I am. Cheers, whistles and jeers rose and fell from the crowd. Miss Shin Manting, are you willing to marry this man in front of you and be with him for the rest of your life? For better or for worse, in health or in sickness, you will be faithful to Mr. Shin Luo, and for the rest of your life? I am. The cheers were even louder and more turbulent than before. Yi Qianqian almost burst into tears when she heard these words from behind. She tugged at Shinjilia's clothes and said, You're finally married. It's not easy. Shinjilia smiled. Yes, it's not easy. I have one more thing to tell you. Yi Qianqian's eyes were smiling. She wrapped her arms around his neck and said softly, I think I'm pregnant. Really? Shinjilia's eyes lit up. Really? Yi Qianqian saw his expression and laughed. I tried 3 pregnancy tests and they all had 2 wires. Haha. Shinjilia didn't bother to hide his laughter. He picked Yi Qianqian up and shouted, I knew my wife was the best. The people standing beside them all looked over. Yi Qianqian was a little embarrassed. She patted him on the shoulder and chided him, Stop shouting. They're all looking at you. Shinjilia was afraid that others wouldn't know, so he hugged her and shouted, I'm going to be a father. My wife is pregnant. These words once again caused an uproar and the elders to laugh in surprise. Enchanting buried her face in his chest. She couldn't help but smile. At the wedding there was double happiness. Laughter and music filled with happiness flowed on everyone's faces and hearts. We're married. I'm going to be a father. Get lost, don't steal my limelight. Ha! Hit me. Wanli, this seems to be the first proper ending. Sigh, I don't want to write about the matters of the adults anymore. Writing makes me so tired. I want to write about the children. Next I'll write about the trivial matters between Daesu, Su Mosun and Yu Chulin. Many people might not want to see siblings fooling around, but it's okay. I haven't thought about who will be with who. But without a doubt this is a story of a crush and a crush, but foolishly thinking that it's unrequited love. Because it's foreign, I want to try a genre that I haven't tried before. Those who know me all know my methods. It'll be a little sadistic and sweet. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.